Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. This one is personal. It takes me back to a time I've tried hard to forget. Though no matter how much I wish to leave it behind, it keeps creeping back into my thoughts. For those of you who've spent late nights in strange places, you'll understand what I mean. It all started about 7 years ago, in the fall. I was working as a night orderly at a hospital in my hometown. It wasn't a big city, just one of those places where everybody knows everybody. The hospital was old, built in the early 1900s. They had expanded it several times over the years, but some of the original structure still stood. Long hallways with peeling paint, flickering fluorescent lights, and rooms where silence felt heavier than it should. I had taken the job to help with college expenses. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid decently. The work wasn't all that complicated, helping patients, cleaning up, transporting equipment, and occasionally doing rounds on the upper floors. Most of my shifts were quiet, and I liked it that way. There were only a few of us working the night shift back then. Paul, the security guard, was a tall, burly guy in his mid-40s with a dry sense of humor. Then there was Evelyn, the head nurse, who had been with the hospital for over 25 years. She had a strict demeanor, but once you got to know her, you'd see she cared deeply about the patients. And finally, there was Trevor, another orderly like me. He was a few years older, always cracking jokes to keep things light. We were a small team, and we all got along pretty well. It wasn't uncommon for us to spend our breaks chatting in the staff lounge about everything from sports to local gossip. Nights at the hospital could drag on, so we leaned on each other to pass the time. The hospital was divided into 3 main sections. The newer wing where most of the patients were housed, they're on the ground floor, and the old wing. The old wing had been closed for years, budget cuts, or so they said. It was just left there, locked up, slowly decaying. Everyone joked about how it was haunted, but no one ever really believed it. Trevor liked to tell stories about the old wing to freak me out. He'd say things like, they used to keep the psych patients over there back in the day. The really dangerous ones. Or, people say if you stand by the doors at night, you can hear footsteps inside. It'd roll my eyes, knowing he was just trying to mess with me. But it'd be lying if I said the idea of that place didn't give me chills. The old wing was on the far side of the building, connected to the main hospital by a long, dimly lit corridor. Most of the time, we didn't go near it. The doors were kept locked, and only maintenance had the keys. I'd seen it a few times during training, though. The air felt different there. Stale, heavy, like the place was holding its breath. One night, about a month into the job, I had to take some supplies to a storage room near the old wing. It was around 2 a.m., and the hallways were quiet except for the hum of the overhead lights. I pushed the cart down the corridor, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have. As I passed the double doors to the old wing, I felt something. It's hard to explain, a prickling on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I stopped for a moment, glancing over my shoulder. Nothing, just the empty hallway behind me. I shrugged it off and kept moving, trying to focus on the task at hand. But that feeling stayed with me. Even after I dropped off the supplies and made my way back to the main section of the hospital, I couldn't shake it. Later that night, during our break, I mentioned it to Trevor. "Hey, do you ever feel weird near the old wing?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He smirked. "Weird how?" "Like, I don't know. Like someone's watching you. Man, you're spending too much time over there," he said with a laugh. "But yeah, it's creepy as hell." Evelyn says they used to do experimental treatments back in the day. Stuff they don't talk about now. Shock therapy, lobotomies, the usual. He shrugged like it was no big deal, but the thought of it made my stomach turn. Evelyn walked into the lounge just then, her expression stern. "You boys gossiping again?" Just swapping ghost stories, Trevor said, grinning. Well, keep it down. Some of us have work to do, she said, though there was a flicker of a smile on her face. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about what Trevor had said. I told myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing to worry about. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the old wing wasn't right. And that's how it all began. A sense of unease, a feeling I couldn't explain. Little did I know, it was only the start of what would become the most terrifying experience of my life. It was a Thursday night, mid-October. The kind of night where the chill in the air made its way into the hospital, no matter how high they turned up the heat. The halls felt quieter than usual, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I remember it vividly because everything about that night felt off. I was midway through my shift when Evelyn called me over to help with a patient transfer. It wasn't anything unusual, just moving an elderly woman from the to one of the rooms in the newer wing. The patient, Mrs. Graham, was in her late 70s and recovering from a mild stroke. She was frail but alert, her eyes darting around as we wheeled her bed down the hall. "It's so quiet," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the squeak of the bed's wheels. "It always is at night," I replied, trying to reassure her. "No," she said, shaking her head slightly. "Not like this." I glanced at Evelyn, who gave me a small shrug. Patients often said strange things, especially older ones. I brushed it off, figuring she was just disoriented. But as we turned the corner near the corridor leading to the old wing, Mrs. Graham grabbed my arm. "Don't go that way," she said sharply, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "We're not going that way, Mom," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "Your room is in the opposite direction." She relaxed a little, but kept glancing back toward the closed doors of the old wing, her expression tense. Evelyn didn't say anything, but I could tell she had noticed too. After settling Mrs. Graham into her room, I made my way back to the staff lounge. Trevor was there, leaning back in one of the chairs with his feet up on the table. "What's with you?" he asked, noticing the look on my face. "Nothing," I said, grabbing a cup of coffee. "Just a weird patient." "Weird how?" "She got spooked when we passed the old wing. Told me not to go that way." Trevor raised an eyebrow. "Maybe she knows something we don't." "Cut it out," I said, rolling my eyes. "She's just confused." But even as I said it, I couldn't help but replay the moment in my mind. The way Mrs. Graham had looked at those doors, it wasn't confusion. It was fear. Later that night, around 3 a.m., Evelyn asked me to check on some supplies in the storage room near the old wing. I wasn't thrilled about it, especially after what had happened earlier, but it was part of the job. I grabbed the key from the desk and made my way down the dimly lit corridor. The storage room was at the very end of the hallway, right next to the locked doors of the old wing. As I approached, the sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, echoing off the walls. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over me, telling myself it was just my imagination. The storage room was cramped, filled with shelves of medical supplies and equipment. I found the box of 4 bags Evelyn had asked for and was about to leave when I heard it, a faint sound, almost like a knock, coming from the other side of the wall. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it. But then it happened again. Knock, knock. I turned to look at the wall, separating the storage room from the old wing. The knocks were steady, deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. Just silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen. When nothing did, I grabbed the box of supplies and left the room as quickly as I could. "Probably just the pipes," he said with a shrug. "This place is old as hell." "Yeah, maybe," I muttered, though I wasn't convinced. That night, as I finished my shift and headed home, I couldn't stop thinking about the knocks. Pipes didn't sound like that. And even if they did, why would it happen right as I was in the room? The next night, I was hesitant to go near the old wing again. I stuck to my usual rounds, avoiding that end of the hospital as much as possible. But around midnight, Paul, the security guard, came into the lounge looking uneasy. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Hear what?" Trevor asked, setting down his coffee. "Sounded like footsteps," Paul said, "coming from the old wing." Trevor laughed. "You're messing with us." "I'm serious," Paul said, his expression grim. "I was doing my rounds near the when I heard it. Thought maybe one of you was over there, but when I checked, the doors were locked." A heavy silence fell over the room. For the first time, Trevor didn't have a joke ready. "It's probably nothing," I said, though I didn't believe it. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Every sound, every shadow seemed amplified. And when my shift finally ended, I practically ran to my car, desperate to get away from the hospital. But the worst part was, I knew it'd have to go back the next night. And whatever was happening, it wasn't over. The unease that had crept in over the past few nights didn't fade, it spread. Like a cracking glass, the tension splintered outward, reaching every corner of the hospital. By the time I arrived for my next shift, the atmosphere felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on us. It started small. Little things, like misplaced items or lights flickering in parts of the building where no one had been. Paul mentioned that his radio kept cutting out whenever he passed the old wing, the static crackling loud enough to make him wince. Evelyn swore she saw movement down the hallway near the closed-off doors, but dismissed it as her eyes playing tricks on her. I didn't want to talk about the knocks it heard or the strange silence that seemed to wrap itself around that part of the hospital. But the more I tried to ignore it, the harder it became to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, just before midnight, I was tasked with delivering a patient chart to the ICU. The route took me past the corridor leading to the old wing. As I walked by, I felt it, a cold draft brushing against the back of my neck. I stopped in my tracks, turning around to see if a door or window had been left open. Nothing. The hallway was empty, the air still except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. But that cold sensation lingered, a chill that didn't belong. I hurried to the ICU, my steps quick and deliberate. When I got back to the lounge, Evelyn was sitting with Trevor, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, setting the chart on the table. "I heard something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Heard what?" Trevor asked, leaning forward. She glanced at the door, as if afraid someone, or something, might be listening. I was restocking in the supply closet near there, and I heard footsteps. They were slow, heavy, like someone wearing boots. "Was anyone else down there?" I asked. "No," she said. "I checked the hall. It was empty." Trevor chuckled nervously. "Probably just Paul stomping around on his rounds." "It wasn't Paul," Evelyn said firmly. "I saw him in the break room 5 minutes before it happened." The room fell silent. Even Trevor didn't have a comeback this time. The next night, I found myself walking past the old wing again, this time on my way to check on a patient in the orthopedic unit. As I passed the locked doors, I thought I heard something, faint, almost imperceptible. A whisper. I stopped, my heart pounding, and strained to listen. "Help me." The voice was weak, barely audible, but it was there. I turned to the doors, pressing my ear against the cool metal. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice shaky. The response was immediate, a loud bang, as if something had slammed against the other side of the door. I stumbled back, my chest tightening. The noise must be startled someone else, too, because Paul came rushing around the corner, his flashlight beam cutting through the dim hallway. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "It came from the old wing." Paul frowned, shining his flashlight at the locked doors. "It's supposed to be empty. No one's been in there for years." "Well, something's in there," I said. Paul nodded, his jaw tight. "I'll check it out tomorrow, first thing." But I wasn't so sure I wanted to wait until tomorrow. Trevor and Evelyn were both in the lounge, distracted by their phones, so I grabbed a spare flashlight and headed back toward the old wing. The hallway was unnervingly silent, the kind of silence that made your ears strain for even the faintest sound. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a harsh, cold glow on the walls. When I reached the doors, I hesitated. Something about them felt wrong. The air around them was colder than the rest of the hallway, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. I pressed my ear to the door again, holding my breath. At first, there was nothing, just silence. But then, help me. The voice was clearer this time, desperate. I stepped back, my hands shaking. It wasn't just my imagination. Someone, or something, was in there. I didn't want to go in alone, so I went back to the lounge and told Trevor and Evelyn what had happened. "You're messing with us," Trevor said, though his face betrayed his nervousness. "I'm not," I said firmly. "You can come with me if you don't believe me." Evelyn looked hesitant, but nodded. "I'll go," Trevor sighed, standing up. "Fine. Let's get this over with." The three of us made our way back to the old wing, our footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. When we reached the doors, I pointed to the small window set into the metal. "Look," I said, shining my flashlight through the glass. At first, all we saw was darkness. But then, in the beam of the flashlight, something moved. It was subtle, just a flicker of motion, but it was enough to make Evelyn gasp. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Trevor nodded, his face pale. "Yeah." Paul arrived a few minutes later, drawn by our hushed voices and nervous expressions. When we told him what we'd seen, he didn't dismiss us like I thought he might. Instead, he took out his keys and unlocked the doors. "I'll prove there's nothing in there," he said, his tone firm. But as he pushed the doors open, the air seemed to shift. The smell of mildew was stronger, mixed with something else, something metallic. Blood. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The old wing was exactly as I remembered it. Abandoned, the walls peeling, and the floors coated in a thin layer of dust. But there was something else, something that hadn't been there before. Footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, leading down the hallway toward one of the old patient rooms. Paul followed the trail, his flashlight steady. The rest of us stayed close behind, the tension so thick it was hard to breathe. When we reached the room, the door was slightly ajar. Paul pushed it open, his flashlight illuminating the space inside. It was empty, but on the wall, scrawled in what looked like blood, were the words, "Help me." Evelyn let out a small cry, and Trevor swore under his breath. I just stood there, frozen, my mind racing. "All right," Paul said, his voice shaking slightly. "We're done here. Everyone out." We didn't argue. But as we left the old wing and locked the doors behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just scratched the surface of whatever was happening. And whatever it wasn't done with us yet. Paul's decision to lock the doors behind us felt final, but it didn't bring the relief we'd hoped for. Instead, it felt like sealing a lid on a boiling pot, trapping whatever was inside rather than stopping it. The air in the hospital was thick with unease, and every shift seemed darker, quieter, and more oppressive than the last. It was 2 nights later when everything came to a head. The tension that had been building for weeks finally erupted, and it was worse than anything I could have imagined. It was a late shift, the kind that stretched endlessly into the early hours of the morning. Paul was patrolling the main corridors. Trevor was restocking supplies in the ICU, and Evelyn was charting at the nurse's station. I had been assigned to check on a patient in room 213, which was far too close to the old wing for comfort. As I walked down the hall, I noticed the lights flickering again, this time more violently than before. The cold draft returned, chilling my skin even through my uniform. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it was just an old building showing its age. But then, as I passed the doors to the old wing, I froze. The doors were wide open. For a moment, I thought I might have been imagining it. But no, The heavy metal doors that had been locked 2 nights ago were now swinging slightly on their hinges. A low groan came from their movement, echoing eerily in the otherwise silent hallway. "Paul?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Are you here?" No answer. I should have turned around. I should have gone back to the nurse's station and pretended I hadn't seen anything. But something compelled me to step closer. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was a sense of responsibility to find out what was going on. Either way, I crossed the threshold into the old wing. The air inside was colder than I remembered, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the peeling paint and crumbling ceiling tiles. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty corridor. That's when I heard it, a sound so faint I almost missed it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on a hard surface. It was coming from further down the hall, near one of the old patient rooms. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the sound. With each step, the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. By the time I reached the room at the end of the hallway, it felt deafening. I pushed the door open slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The room was empty, or so I thought. But then my beam landed on the far corner, and my breath caught in my throat. There was a figure crouched there, its back to me. It was human in shape, but horribly wrong. The limbs were too long, the joints bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was a sickly, pale gray, stretched taut over its bones. "Who's there?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. For a moment, I thought it might not have heard me. But then, slowly, it turned its head. Its face, or what was left of it, was grotesque. The eyes were sunken, hollow voids, and its mouth was a gaping, toothless maw. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze boring into me, freezing me in place. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there. But my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was stare as the figure began to rise, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. Behind me, I heard footsteps. I whipped around to see Paul, Trevor, and Evelyn rushing down the hall, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. "What are you doing in here?" Paul demanded, his voice sharp. Before I could answer, the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't just coming from the room, it was all around us. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. It was everywhere. "Do you hear that?" Evelyn whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Paul nodded, his flashlight beam darting around the corridor. "Stay close. We're getting out of here." But as we turned to leave, the door at the end of the hall slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Evelyn screamed, and Trevor swore, pulling at the door handle. "It won't open," he shouted, his voice panicked. The tapping grew louder, faster, until it was an unrelenting cacophony. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was suffocating. And then we saw it. The figure from the room was standing in the hallway now, its grotesque form illuminated by our flashlights. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures emerged from the shadows, each one as twisted and unnatural as the first. They moved toward us slowly, their heads twitching unnaturally, their hollow eyes fixed on us. "Back up," Paul shouted, his voice shaking. "Get to the other door." We stumbled backward, our flashlights shaking as we tried to find another way out. But the figures kept coming, their movements jerky and relentless. Trevor tried to push past them, his flashlight swinging wildly, but one of the figures reached out and grabbed him. He screamed as it pulled him toward the darkness, his voice echoing down the hallway. "Trevor!" Evelyn cried, but Paul grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the emergency exit at the far end of the wing. "Keep moving," he yelled. We reached the emergency exit, but the door wouldn't budge. Paul threw his weight against it, but it was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. The figures were getting closer, their hollow eyes fixed on us. I could feel their cold, unnatural presence pressing in, suffocating. "Do something," Evelyn screamed, tears streaming down her face. Paul pulled a fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it at the nearest figure. It staggered back, but the others kept advancing. I grabbed a chair and swung it wildly, but it felt futile. They didn't seem to feel pain or fear. They just kept coming. Then, without warning, the lights in the old wing flickered and went out completely, plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black, all I could hear was Evelyn sobbing, Paul shouting, and the sound of those figures, closer now, their breathing shallow and ragged. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the figures were gone. The hallway was empty, silent except for our ragged breathing. The morning after the incident, we were a wreck. We hadn't slept, not even for a second. Each of us had experienced something different, but the terror we felt was shared. Paul tried to be the voice of reason. He called the hospital's administration, asking for an investigation, trying to make sense of what had happened. But when they arrived to inspect the old wing, they found nothing out of the ordinary. No open doors, no strange occurrences, just a desolate, abandoned hallway. They even asked if we had been hallucinating or if our stress had gotten to us. But the look in Paul's eyes as he stood there, explaining what we had witnessed, told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't making it up. Neither was I. We had seen something real, something unnatural. In the days following, we all tried to go about our normal duties. But none of us were the same. The building felt colder, emptier, like the darkness we had felt in that wing had seeped into every crevice, every room. Evelyn, who had always been a strong presence at work, had begun to retreat into herself. Her usual confident stride was now a hesitant shuffle. Trevor's disappearance remained a shadow hanging over us, but the hospital staff didn't seem to notice. He was gone, just another lost soul that had slipped through the cracks of the system. There were no questions asked. As for me, I kept seeing his face, the image of Trevor being dragged away, his eyes wide with terror. It was like his scream had been burned into my memory, replaying over and over again in my mind. I couldn't escape it. It wasn't long before I started questioning whether any of us should return to the hospital. The unsettling events in that old wing had left their mark, and every night I lay in bed wondering what might still be lurking in the dark, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul. The old wing was abandoned, yes, but that didn't make it safe. One evening, just as the last of the lights dimmed in the building, I found Paul standing outside, staring at the old hospital building. He didn't look at me as I approached, but I knew he was waiting for me to speak. "Paul," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here. We can't keep pretending like nothing happened. It's not safe." He nodded slowly, his face pale. I've been thinking the same thing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, looking at the looming structure, knowing that our time there was finished. The following night, we went back to the hospital together, but only to retrieve our personal belongings. We weren't going back to work, not after what had happened. The tension was thick in the air as we walked down the sterile hallways for the last time. There were no strange occurrences this time, no flickering lights or unearthly tapping. It was almost too quiet. The moment we entered the old wing, we both froze. It felt as though the very air around us had shifted. The temperature dropped, and a heavy stillness settled over us. "I don't think we should be here," Paul said quietly. "I agree," I replied, but something pulled me forward. Maybe it was the need for closure or the sick curiosity that gnawed at me. We reached the entrance to the old wing, the place where it all started. The door was still ajar, and the darkness beyond it was impenetrable. Neither of us moved, just staring at the void, trying to make sense of what we were seeing or what we weren't. "I think we need to go," Paul urged, but it felt like something was holding us there. Then, as though to answer our unspoken question, something stirred in the shadows of the old hallway. A figure stepped out, its tall, lanky form barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't see its face, but the cold dread that settled in my stomach told me it was the same one we had seen before. I felt my body tense, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The figure didn't move closer, though. It just stood there, staring. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, in the cold silence, a single word echoed through the empty hallway. Leave! The word was so clear, so commanding, that it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't wait another second. I grabbed Paul by the arm, pulling him away. Without looking back, we ran. We didn't stop until we were out of the building, gasping for breath as we stood in the parking lot. We never went back to that hospital. We both resigned soon after, trying to put the experience behind us. But that night, and everything that followed, would never leave us. We had been part of something that defied logic, something that no one would ever understand. Years passed, but the memory of that place, of what we saw and heard, lingered like a scar across my mind. I tried to forget, but every so often, something would remind me, a sound, a shadow, a flicker of light, and I would be back there again, standing at the edge of the old wing, staring into the dark. And I'd always hear that same voice in my head, the one that told us to leave. Because in the end, it wasn't just a hospital. It was something more. Something that was never meant to be understood. Something that would always be there, waiting. And I could never shake the feeling that it was still watching, waiting for the next person to walk through that door. Time has a funny way of distorting the past. At least, that's what I tell myself when I think back on the events that transpired in that hospital. What I experienced, there is something that defies logic, and it's something that has stayed with me, not just in the fleeting memories, but in the quiet moments that haunt me, no matter how many years pass. It's been years since we walked away from that place, since we left behind the questions, the fear, the twisted sensation that followed us like a shadow. We moved on, as much as anyone can, and yet, when I look back on that time, it's still as vivid as ever. The fear, the uncertainty, the oppressive feeling that someone was watching us. I've often wondered whether the hospital was ever truly haunted, or if it was just a collective break from reality. After all, what happened to Trevor? Where did he go? There's never been an answer. No one ever found a trace of him, not even a whisper. To this day, I don't know if what we saw was an apparition, a shadow of the past, or if it was something far more tangible and terrifying. Paul and I have both tried to live with the uncertainty, but that question of what really happened will always linger. For a long time, I thought that maybe, if I could just let go, the memories would fade. But they haven't. They never did. And each year, when I pass that old hospital, I can feel the pull, the need to know more, to understand what happened. But I know deep down that some things are better left unsaid, and some questions, once asked, can never be answered. There are so many things he'll never know. He'll never understand why we were drawn to that hospital in the first place, why we stayed as long as we did. Was it fate that led us there, or was it something more sinister, something that wanted us to see it all? What about Trevor? His disappearance, his last moments, still feel like a scar that hasn't healed. Was he taken by whatever was in that building, or did something happen to him that we'll never understand? We never found any answers, and for all the theories we discussed, none of them ever fit. And that's the scariest part. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that we were meant to see those things, meant to be part of whatever strange, terrifying world those walls held. Maybe it's a reflection of the unknown that we'll never quite grasp. The fact that there are some things, some places, that simply don't make sense. Places where the air feels thick with secrets, and the walls have memories of their own. The hospital, that wing, it wasn't just a building. It was something else, something that existed outside of our understanding. The more I think about it, the more I realize that it wasn't just the hospital that was haunted. It was us. We were haunted by what we saw, by what we felt, by the things we can't explain. We carry that with us, wherever we go. And I suppose that's something I've had to come to terms with. It all began a few years ago in a coastal town tucked away on the edge of nowhere. I had just come out of a rough patch in my life, the kind where you wonder if there's anything left to hope for. I needed a change of scenery, something quiet to clear my mind. So, when I saw the ad for a caretaker position at an old lighthouse on the outskirts of town, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to reset. The lighthouse had been abandoned for years after the last keeper had passed away under mysterious circumstances, and the town council was looking for someone to keep an eye on it. They offered a modest wage, free room and board, and the solitude I desperately craved. I took the job without much thought, eager to leave behind the noise of the city. The lighthouse stood on a rocky promontory, isolated from the rest of the town. A narrow road, barely wide enough for a car, led up to the towering structure. The sea was always visible from every angle, crashing against the jagged cliffs below. At first glance, the lighthouse was nothing remarkable, just a tall, weathered stone tower with a blinking light at the top. But there was something about it that felt off, like a lingering presence, as if the place itself carried the weight of years of forgotten stories. I wasn't alone at the lighthouse. There were a few people in the town, but most lived far from the coast, content to let the lighthouse be forgotten. Still, there was an unsettling energy surrounding it that kept people away. Most of the locals avoided even talking about it. When I first mentioned the lighthouse to the bartender at a local pub, he quickly changed the subject, giving me a nervous look. That should have been my first clue, but I didn't pay much attention. The job itself was simple. My daily routine consisted of checking the light, making sure the lens was clean, and keeping an eye on the tower's surroundings. I would often walk the rocky shore, watching the waves crash against the rocks, feeling the salty wind whip through my hair. There was a peace in the routine, a comfort that allowed me to focus on nothing more than the hum of the lighthouse light and the sea's rhythmic crashing. It was exactly what I needed. The caretaker's house was small and humble, located just to the side of the lighthouse. It was cozy, with a fireplace that crackled in the evenings and a view of the endless ocean through the windows. The isolation was both a relief and a source of strange unease. I would spend my evenings reading or cooking simple meals, listening to the occasional distant cry of a seabird. And every night, before I went to bed, I would go outside to check on the lighthouse, just a quick walk around the tower to ensure everything was in order. For the first few weeks, everything went smoothly. There were no strange occurrences, no signs of anything unusual. But then, one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I started to feel watched. It wasn't an overt sensation, nothing obvious, just a creeping feeling that something was there, just beyond the edge of my vision. I would catch myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced that someone or something was standing behind me. But when I turned, the beach was empty. The wind carried only the sound of the waves. I tried to brush it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I had just moved from the bustle of city life, and the silence of the lighthouse, so far from the distractions of the world, was a new experience. But the feeling lingered, persistent and uncomfortable, and it was then that I started to hear the noises. It began softly, faint knocks on the walls, like someone tapping from the inside. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the old wood creaking with the wind. But the sounds grew more frequent, more deliberate. Sometimes I would hear footsteps outside my window, slow and heavy, like someone pacing just beyond the glass. I'd rush to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever it was, but every time there was nothing, just the vast, empty expanse of the sea stretching to the horizon. By this point, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse itself was somehow alive, that it was watching me, waiting for something. The air inside the tower felt thick, charged, like the weight of history was pressing down on me. And yet, every time I stood in front of the tower, I felt compelled to check on the light, to make sure it was running as it should. Something about it made me feel like I couldn't leave, like I had to stay. I began to wonder if the previous caretakers had felt the same way, drawn to the lighthouse by some invisible force, something they couldn't explain. But that was just the beginning. What followed would change everything I thought I knew about that place. And as the days went on, I realized that I wasn't alone. Not truly. The first truly unsettling thing happened one evening when I was walking along the cliffside, the sky awash of purple and gold as the sun sank lower behind the horizon. The salty breeze was warm, and the usual calming sound of the ocean waves crashing against the rocks was almost hypnotic. I had developed a routine, walking the perimeter of the lighthouse before the night shift began, checking for any signs of trouble, any disturbances. On that particular evening, I was lost in the rhythm of the waves and the view, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. As I rounded the back of the lighthouse, a faint, almost imperceptible sound caught my attention, something out of place. It was a soft scratching, as though something was gently dragging across the stone. I froze, scanning the area around me. The lighthouse was surrounded by jagged rocks and sparse vegetation, all quiet. There was nothing visible to explain the noise. It seemed to come from somewhere just beyond the reach of my sight, behind the tower itself. I felt a brief flash of discomfort, but quickly dismissed it as an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other small creature making its way through the underbrush. I continued my walk, not willing to let the noise bother me. But as I approached the front of the lighthouse again, the sound persisted. This time, it was louder, more distinct, a dragging, scraping sound, followed by a soft tapping, like the muffled footfalls of someone walking just out of sight. My heart skipped a beat. I paused, trying to gauge the source of the noise. There was no one around. No one could be out here. I would have heard footsteps on the gravel driveway or someone approaching from the road. But there was nothing. Just the deep silence of the evening, broken only by the strange sounds I couldn't place. I felt my muscles tense up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. For a moment, I thought about turning and heading back inside the lighthouse, but something stopped me. Something deep inside told me to investigate. I made my way to the side of the lighthouse where the noise seemed to be coming from, the sound growing faint as I walked closer. When I rounded the corner, I froze. There, just beneath the tower's base, a small pile of rocks had been shifted. The ground around them was disturbed, as if someone had been kneeling and moving them. But no one had been there. I had just walked this way minutes earlier, and the ground had been untouched. I knelt down, my fingers brushing against the rocks. A chill ran through me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The scraping noise, the dragging sound, was still in my ears, echoing in my mind, even though the source was gone. I scanned the area once more, my breath shallow as I stood up and looked around. Nothing. The air was thick, almost oppressive. I turned and made my way back to the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The calmness of the evening had been replaced by an unsettling weight, like something was lurking just out of sight. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to think about it. But I knew something had happened. Something I couldn't understand. Inside the lighthouse, I quickly locked the door behind me, the comforting click of the bolt echoing in the small room. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a trick of the wind or an animal moving around the tower. But that explanation didn't sit right with me. There was something deliberate in the way the rocks had been disturbed, the way the sound had stopped the moment I looked around the corner. Later that night, as I went about my usual duties, I couldn't stop thinking about the noise. I checked the light, ensuring it was functioning properly, then stepped outside once more, trying to clear my mind. The air was crisp now, the sky darkened, and the lighthouse beam cut through the night. I stood there for a while, staring out at the ocean, listening to the sounds of the sea, the wind, and the occasional call of a bird. But then, just as I was about to head back inside, I heard it again. The scraping, the dragging. This time, it was closer, almost directly behind me. My pulse quickened as I spun around, but again, there was nothing. The beach was empty, the rocks still and undisturbed. I felt the hairs on my arms prickle with the unmistakable feeling of being watched. My breath came faster now, panic setting in. I was alone, completely alone, but the sound persisted, echoing through my mind. I rushed back into the lighthouse, closing the door behind me and leaning against it as though the physical act of shutting out the night would keep whatever was out there away. The strange sensation of being watched lingered, though. It didn't leave me, no matter how many times I checked the windows or peered through the small gaps in the blinds. It was as if something, or someone, was waiting, watching, just beyond the door. I spent the rest of the night trying to stay busy, keeping my mind occupied. But every now and then, I would hear the faint scrape of something dragging across the ground, just at the edge of my hearing. It came and went in waves, but each time it seemed to draw closer. It was as though the space around me was growing tighter, like the walls were slowly closing in. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I stayed awake, staring at the lighthouse beam, willing the morning to come, hoping the light of day would chase away the shadows creeping into the corners of my mind. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease that clung to me like a shadow. It had to be my imagination, I told myself. Maybe the wind or the sound of the waves had played tricks on me. But as I went about my morning routine, checking the lighthouse, making my breakfast, something caught my eye. The same pile of rocks I had seen the previous night was disturbed again, as if someone had moved them during the night. I had barely moved the rocks, and yet they had been shifted. My heart began to race again, the same dread creeping up my spine. This time, I didn't try to dismiss it. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. The strange events didn't stop. In fact, they became more frequent, more intense. At first, I tried to brush them off as coincidences. Maybe I was just overworked, tired, or letting my mind play tricks on me. But as the days passed, the sense of unease only deepened. It was no longer just the occasional scraping sound or the unsettling feeling of being watched. It was as though something, someone, was trying to make its presence known. I remember one evening, about a week after the first incident, when I was standing at the window, watching the sea. The lighthouse was bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, and everything seemed peaceful. The soft lapping of the waves against the shore, the rustling of the trees in the breeze, it all felt normal. But then, a shadow moved across the rocky shoreline. It was quick, too quick for a person. I leaned forward, squinting to see if it was just a trick of the light, but the shadow darted behind a rock formation, disappearing from sight. My breath caught in my throat. I had no idea what I had just seen, but the feeling that I wasn't alone surged through me again, stronger than ever. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way outside, trying to push the growing sense of dread aside. The last thing I wanted was to be seen as paranoid or irrational, but I couldn't ignore the strange happenings any longer. As I stepped onto the gravel path, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore was louder now, almost deafening in the stillness of the evening. The lighthouse beam swept across the darkening landscape, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. I walked along the cliffs, shining my flashlight on the rocks and the tall grass swaying in the wind, but there was no sign of anyone. Nothing out of the ordinary. The air was thick with moisture, the salty tang of the ocean in my nose. It wasn't until I reached the spot where I'd seen the shadow that I felt it, the sudden drop in temperature. It was as if someone had opened a door to a cold room, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the evening air. I paused, trying to steady my breathing, feeling the hairs on my neck rise. The flashlight beam danced across the rocks, revealing nothing. I scanned the area for any sign of movement, but the landscape was eerily still. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught it again. A flicker, a shadow moving just beyond the reach of the light. This time, I was sure I wasn't imagining it. The shadow moved across the rocks, deliberate and slow, as though it were watching me. My heart raced. I shone the light directly toward the spot where I had seen it, but it was gone. Nothing but the empty, desolate shore in front of me. The air felt heavier now, thick with something I couldn't quite put into words. I didn't want to, but I had to go check. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way toward the rocks where I had seen the shadow. The closer I got, the colder the air became, until I could feel the chill on my skin. I reached the spot and knelt down, shining my flashlight along the ground. There, beneath a large stone, was something that made my stomach drop. It was a footprint, half imprinted in the dirt, just barely visible in the fading light. The print was large, too large for anyone I knew, and it seemed to have a strange shape to it, as though the toes were elongated, claw-like. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the print, my flashlight trembling in my hand. What was this? It didn't make sense. Who or what was out here? I slowly backed away from the footprint, my thoughts racing. I had to get inside. I had to be sure. I turned around and hurried back toward the lighthouse, the light of the beam barely helping to ease the feeling of terror creeping up my spine. The chill lingered, clinging to me, as though I had somehow brought it with me. That night, I stayed inside the lighthouse. I checked the windows every few minutes, half expecting to see something or someone out there in the dark, watching me. But there was nothing. Just the wind, the waves, and the silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, the events began to escalate further. I went out for my morning rounds, checking the lighthouse and the surrounding area. I was walking the perimeter, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that I was being followed, when I came across something that made my stomach lurch. It was the same pile of rocks I had seen disturbed days before, but this time there was something different, something new. A small object lay just beside the pile, something that didn't belong. It was an old, tarnished key, its edges jagged and worn with age. I bent down to pick it up, and as my fingers brushed against it, a wave of nausea washed over me. The air felt suddenly thick, heavy, as though the weight of something unseen pressed down on me. I held the key in my hand, the cold metal sending a chill through my fingers, and I couldn't help but feel that it was connected to whatever was happening. I had no idea what had opened, or why it had appeared here, but I couldn't shake the sense of dread that came with it. Something was happening, something I didn't understand, and I knew I needed answers. That night, I decided to investigate the lighthouse itself. Maybe there was something hidden inside, something I had missed. I had already checked the main rooms, the tower, but I hadn't dared go down into the basement. It had always been locked, the door bolted shut, but now it felt like the place I had to go. The key in my hand seemed to call to me, its cold weight a constant reminder of the mystery I was trying to solve. I made my way down the spiral staircase, the beams of my flashlight cutting through the darkness as I approached the basement door. The lock was old, rusted, but the key fit perfectly. I turned it slowly, the metal scraping against the lock, and then the door creaked open. The air down there was damp, thick with the smell of mildew and salt. I stepped inside, my flashlight trembling as I scanned the room. There was nothing particularly remarkable about it, just shelves of old tools and equipment, remnants of the lighthouse past. But something about the room felt wrong. The air was heavier here, thick with a kind of oppressive silence that made every sound seem amplified. I was about to turn back when I noticed something on the far wall. It was a strange marking, almost like a symbol, carved into the stone. I stepped closer, my heart racing in my chest. The symbol was jagged, etched deeply into the rock, and as my flashlight beam fell on it, I swear I saw it shift, just for a moment. Like it was moving. The temperature dropped suddenly, the coldness settling in my bones, and that was when I heard it, a sound, faint but unmistakable. The scratching noise, the same sound I had heard all those nights ago. This time, it was closer, more distinct, and as I stood there, frozen in place, I realized I wasn't alone. The atmosphere in the basement shifted, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I stood frozen in place. The scratching noise, it was unmistakable. Closer now. It was as if something, or someone, was just behind the wall. My flashlight beam trembled as I shone it toward the source of the sound. The faint, almost imperceptible scratching became louder, more deliberate, until it was all I could hear. My mind raced. What could it be? A rat? A larger animal? Or something worse? I stepped back, my foot brushing against the cold stone floor, and that's when I saw it. There, behind a shelf filled with old, rusted equipment, a portion of the wall had been disturbed. It looked different, as though something had recently been dragged across it. My flashlight flickered, and my breath caught as I realized the wall wasn't solid. It was a hidden passage. My hand shook as I reached out, moving the shelf slightly to reveal a faint outline in the stone. A door, one I hadn't noticed before. The scratching sound stopped, replaced by the deafening silence of the basement. The air felt thick, impossibly heavy, as though the world was holding its breath. I turned the flashlight back on, trying to steady my hand, and with a groan, the door creaked open. The space behind it was dark, darker than anything I had ever seen. The flashlight barely penetrated the blackness. But there, just beyond the threshold, something gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the faint light. Without thinking, I stepped forward. My breath caught in my throat, and my stomach twisted as I entered the room. The temperature dropped immediately, colder than the already chilled air of the basement. A sharp, biting cold that seeped through my clothes and into my bones. I shivered, trying to ignore the gnawing fear creeping up my spine, but it was impossible. The room was small, hidden beneath the lighthouse for who knew how long. On the far side of the room, there was something tied to the wall, an object wrapped in tattered cloth. I couldn't see it clearly at first, but the faint glint of metal gave me pause. My pulse raced as I walked closer. The scratching sound returned, this time coming from the other side of the room. I turned sharply, shining the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. My hand was shaking uncontrollably now as I reached for the cloth. I pulled it away slowly, my stomach tightening with anticipation, and revealed what lay beneath it. It was an old, weathered mirror. The surface was cracked, and the frame was ornate, dark wood edged with strange symbols. I didn't recognize them, but they looked old, ancient, even. The mirror was completely still, reflecting nothing but the bare walls of the small room. I took a cautious step closer, wondering if the mirror was the source of the unease that had been growing inside me for days. Then, as I peered into the glass, I saw something that made my breath catch. A figure, tall, shrouded in darkness, stood behind me in the reflection. It had no face, only a shadowy outline that was impossible to make out. My heart slammed against my ribs as I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. Nothing. I turned back to the mirror, and this time, the figure moved. It was behind me in the reflection, shifting slightly, as if it were inching closer. I was frozen. My body refused to obey my frantic mind, as though I were being paralyzed by the figure in the glass. I couldn't tear my gaze away. I felt like I was trapped in the reflection, like something invisible was pulling me toward it, drawing me deeper into its depths. That's when I heard the voice. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't even a sound I could fully comprehend. It was like a presence, a force that pressed in on me from all directions. The voice was familiar, and yet it wasn't. It was hollow, distant, and cold, like the air had turned to ice, and my own thoughts were being consumed. "Turn it off. Now," it said. I couldn't understand the words at first, but the more I stood there, staring into the reflection, the more they grew clear. The figure in the mirror began to move closer still, its dark form becoming more defined, more solid. Fear shot through me like a bolt of lightning, and finally, my instincts kicked in. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, my hand reaching for the door as I tried to break free from the grip the mirror had on me. But it wasn't enough. The door slammed shut as soon as I touched it, and I was thrown back into the center of the room. I turned wildly, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing. The mirror, the voice, the figure, it was all too much. I had to get out. I had to escape, but the air had thickened to an unbearable weight. The scratching sound from earlier returned, louder now, as though something was crawling just beneath the floorboards. It felt like the very walls of the basement were closing in on me, suffocating me, trapping me inside with whatever was trying to get to me. The mirror was no longer reflecting the room. Instead, it was reflecting something else, something beyond the glass. There was a vast, endless void, a dark expanse that swallowed everything in its wake. The reflections seemed to warp and shift, distorting the world around it. And then, from the darkness beyond the glass, the figure reached out. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was solid, a grotesque form emerging from the glass, as though it were breaking through the very fabric of reality. Its arms, elongated and twisted, reached toward me, its fingers clawing at the edges of the mirror. The air grew colder still, until I could see my breath in the faint light of the flashlight. I screamed, a primal, desperate cry, and without thinking, I turned and ran. The door flung open with a force I couldn't explain, and I burst out into the main basement. My breath was coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled through the darkened halls of the lighthouse, my feet tripping over the uneven ground. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to get out. The stairs were endless as I ran up, the pounding of my feet echoing in my ears. When I finally reached the top, I burst into the light, the moon casting a pale glow over the rocky shore. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. I spun around, but the lighthouse was empty. I was alone. I stood there in the cold light of the moon, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. The pounding in my chest didn't slow, even as the steady sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below seemed to wash away some of the tension. The air felt too thick to breathe, too heavy to think clearly. I was trembling, not from the cold, but from what I had just experienced, from what it'd seen. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, unable to tear my gaze from the lighthouse itself. The structure loomed over me like a dark sentinel, its windows staring back at me like eyes. My mind kept replaying the vision in the mirror, the shadow that reached for me, the voice that seemed to come from nowhere. The feeling that something beyond the reflection had tried to pull me in, that it had almost succeeded. I had to leave. I had to get away from this place. I turned on my heel, stumbling slightly, and made my way down the crumbling stone path that led back to the small cottage I'd rented near the cliffs. Every step felt like a lifetime, every shadow a threat, and I couldn't shake the sensation that something was still behind me, watching me, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I forced myself to look over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the empty, quiet lighthouse, its dim light flickering weakly against the night sky. Once I reached the cottage, I slammed the door behind me, locking it with more force than necessary. My heart still raced, but I had nowhere to go. The lighthouse had already haunted me for days, and now it had chased me into my own thoughts. It was as though the very essence of the place had seeped into my bones, and no matter how far I went, it would follow. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer, though. I couldn't ignore what had happened, what I had seen. I sat down at the small wooden table, my hands shaking as I poured myself a glass of water. The cool liquid barely touched the burning in my throat. My mind kept circling back to the mirror, to the figure, to the sensation of something watching me, something evil, something ancient. What was it? Who was it? I had to know, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the answers I sought might be things I wasn't ready to uncover. The idea of going back to the lighthouse sent a cold shiver down my spine, but the questions remained. Why had I been drawn there in the first place? What had the voice meant? And why had it called to me? The next morning, I gathered every ounce of courage I could muster and made my way back to the lighthouse. The sun had risen, casting an eerie glow over the cliffside. The lighthouse looked different in the daylight, no longer the looming, sinister figure of the night before, but something quiet, forgotten almost. It was as if the world around it had moved on, leaving it to stand alone, abandoned. I walked toward it slowly, my steps deliberate, each one echoing in the stillness of the morning. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound of rusted hinges causing a chill to race through me. I stepped inside, the smell of salt and old stone filling my nostrils. The silence was suffocating. I made my way back down to the basement, every step heavier than the last. The door was still ajar, and when I reached it, I hesitated. The air inside was cold, colder than it had been before. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the walls seemed to close in around me. The flashlight was still on the ground where it left it, lying beside the mirror, the same eerie glow flickering from its cracked surface. I turned the flashlight off, swallowing the lump in my throat. The quiet was almost unbearable. I wanted to scream, but I wasn't sure if it was fear or the uncertainty of what I would find that held me in place. I was alone. But then the scratching returned. Soft at first, as though it were coming from somewhere far away. Slowly, it grew louder, sharper, more insistent. It was coming from the walls, scraping, clawing, as though something was trying to break through. I moved toward the door, the sound of it scraping against the stone floor echoing through the basement. My fingers brushed against the cold metal handle, but before I could turn it, the mirror caught my eye again. This time, I couldn't look away. The figure was there again, this time closer, clearer. Its outline seemed to shimmer and shift as though the reflection was alive. It was almost as though the figure knew I was watching, its dark form tilting toward me, drawing me in with each passing second. My hand reached out, almost of its own volition, and I felt the faintest pull toward the glass, as though something was tugging at my very soul. But this time, I resisted. I backed away, my breath coming in short, quick gasps, and I ran out of the basement, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I left the lighthouse once and for all. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even in the safety of my cottage, I could feel it, the pressure on my chest, the gnawing fear at the back of my mind. It never fully went away, no matter how hard I tried to push it down. The lighthouse, the mirror, the figure. It was as though it had seeped into my very being. I left the town a week later, my mind still haunted by what I had experienced. The answers I had sought had only brought more questions. And while I had left the lighthouse behind, I could still feel it, like a shadow over my life, something I could never fully escape. I didn't speak about it to anyone. No one would have believed me anyway. And part of me, most of me, wanted to forget what had happened. To move on, to live without the weight of that place hanging over me. But every now and then, late at night, I would find myself lying awake, staring into the dark, the sound of scratching in my ears, the reflection of that figure flashing behind my eyes. I would hear the voice again, distant and hollow, and I would wonder if the lighthouse was truly behind me, or if it was still calling, waiting for me to return. I left the town behind, the lighthouse fading in the rearview mirror as I drove farther away, but I couldn't escape the feeling. No matter where I went, it lingered, like an unseen force trailing behind me. At night, in the silence of my new home, I would sometimes hear it, scratching, faint and soft, as though it was coming from the walls. The unmistakable feeling of being watched. I couldn't help but think of that mirror, of the figure inside it, and the way it had reached out to me. I couldn't forget the voice, the pull, the sense of doom that had followed me back from that place. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, the trauma of what I had witnessed distorting reality. Maybe it was the isolation of the lighthouse, the deep quiet that surrounded it, that had played on my nerves. Maybe it was the stress of being there alone, my mind creating things to fill the emptiness. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, there was always a part of me that knew, deep down, that what I had experienced was real, that there was something in that lighthouse, something old and dark that I couldn't explain. And no matter how far I ran, I could feel it waiting. For weeks, I lived in this state of denial, convincing myself that it was just a bad experience, that time would help me forget. But there was no forgetting. The more I tried, the more the feeling grew, like a shadow creeping into my life, always just out of reach, but never gone. One evening, months after leaving the lighthouse behind, I received a letter. It was strange because I hadn't given my new address to anyone. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper old and faded. There were no return details, just a single line that made my heart stop. You should have stayed away. The letter sent a cold chill down my spine, a feeling I couldn't shake, even after reading it over and over. How did someone know? Who could have possibly known what I had been through, what I had seen? I had never gone back to the lighthouse. I had never told anyone about the things it experienced. But somehow, someone knew, and that thought gnawed at me, a constant reminder that what I had felt wasn't just in my mind. It wasn't just a memory fading with time. It was real. It was still out there. A part of me wanted to go back, to return to that place and face it, to confront whatever it was that had haunted me since the moment I stepped foot in the lighthouse. But another part of me, deep down, knew that some things should stay buried. Some things were better left undisturbed. The letter stayed with me for weeks, tucked away in a drawer, its words echoing in the back of my mind. I didn't want to acknowledge it. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't forget it either. It was as though the lighthouse had followed me, had reached across the distance to make sure I understood the warning. Now, every time I look out at the horizon, I think of that lighthouse, standing tall and unmoving against the crashing waves. It's as if it's still there, watching, waiting. And every night, when I lie in bed, I hear it again, the faint scratching, the distant murmur of a voice. It's not constant, but it's enough. Enough to remind me that the lighthouse isn't finished with me. That whatever was there, whatever I had felt, is still calling to me from the shadows. I can never truly leave. And though I try to tell myself that I've escaped, that the lighthouse is just a memory now, I know better. There are some things that never let you go. They linger in the corners of your mind, in the spaces between breaths. They wait for you to forget, to slip, to return. And if you're not careful, they'll be there when you least expect it, watching, waiting, and calling you back. It was the summer of 2004 when we, a group of close friends, set out on what we thought would be a typical camping trip. The kind of trip we had done a dozen times before, full of laughter, campfires, and the thrill of spending time deep in nature, away from the distractions of the city. Our destination was an old, secluded forest in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where the trees are thick, the air feels heavy with history, and it's far enough away that no one ever really goes there anymore. I had heard about this forest from a friend of mine who had visited a few times before. He spoke of it in a way that made it sound like an ideal retreat, a place to disconnect from everything, clear your head, and maybe even have a bit of adventure. The forest was known for being vast, mysterious, and oddly untouched. No one seemed to remember when it had been last properly explored, and that made it all the more intriguing. There were 6 of us in total. Me, Jack, Tom, Peter, Ben, and Laura. We were all in our late 20s, working ordinary jobs and living relatively simple lives. Jack and I were childhood friends, and Tom, Peter, and Ben were people I'd met during my college years. Laura was Tom's girlfriend, who had been part of our group for about a year. We were the kind of group that enjoyed the great outdoors, but didn't necessarily seek out danger. We went camping to escape the stress of everyday life, not to look for trouble. That morning, we packed up our gear and set out in Ben's old van, which had been converted into a makeshift camper for these types of trips. The sun was already high in the sky, and the heat made the drive feel longer than it really was. We joked and laughed the whole way, each of us sharing stories from our week, talking about our job, relationships, and plans for the future. At that point, everything felt so normal, so right. We had no idea what was waiting for us in the woods. We arrived around noon, and as we stepped out of the van, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't like the usual silence you find in nature, where the wind rustles the trees and birds chirp in the distance. This was a deep, oppressive silence, the kind that makes you feel like the forest is holding its breath. We shrugged it off, figuring it was just part of the unique atmosphere of the place. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We unloaded our bags, set up our tents, and built a campfire. As the evening came, the woods began to feel even more secluded. The sky above us was darkening quickly, and the air grew thick with humidity. We hadn't seen another soul since we arrived, which was both a relief and a bit unsettling. The forest felt like it belonged to no one, as if it had its own set of rules that we were about to learn the hard way. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire. The conversation was light at first, mostly centered around past trips and the occasional joke. But there was an undercurrent to the evening, an unspoken tension in the air. I couldn't help but feel like something was watching us, hidden in the shadows of the trees. It was nothing specific, just an overwhelming sense that we weren't alone. I glanced around at my friends, but no one seemed to notice. They were all too busy laughing and making plans for the next day. Then came the moment that would change everything, the first strange occurrence. It started with a sound, something distant but unmistakable. It was a rustling, like something was moving through the underbrush. But it wasn't the kind of noise made by animals. This was different. It was deliberate. It was as if something was walking, taking slow, measured steps, deliberately avoiding the brush to make as little noise as possible. I looked at Jack, who had heard it too. He stood up, his face pale, eyes scanning the woods. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all fell silent, straining to listen, but the rustling had stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Tom shrugged it off. "Probably just a deer or something. It's a forest, guys. Animals are everywhere." But something about it didn't sit right with me, and I wasn't the only one who felt that way. Laura, usually calm and collected, was staring into the darkness, her expression a mixture of confusion and unease. "That didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard," she said quietly, her voice trembling just a bit. We decided to investigate, our curiosity getting the better of us. We grabbed flashlights and ventured into the woods, sticking together as a group. The trees around us seemed to close in, their gnarled branches creating an almost oppressive canopy above us. The deeper we went, the more the air seemed to thicken. We couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but we pressed on. When we reached the area where we thought we had heard the rustling, we found nothing. No signs of movement, no tracks, nothing. It was as if whatever had been there had vanished into thin air. We made our way back to camp, trying to ignore the growing unease among us. But I could see it in their eyes. Everyone felt it. Something wasn't right. That night, as we lay in our tents, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the sound of footsteps outside, soft and deliberate, just like before. I wanted to call out to my friends, but I didn't. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't welcome in those woods. As I lay there, wide awake, I couldn't help but wonder, was this just a strange coincidence, or had we stumbled upon something much darker than we had ever imagined? That's when it started to sink in. This wasn't going to be the relaxing trip we'd hoped for. Something was waiting for us in the forest, and it wasn't friendly. The following morning, after an uneasy night of restless sleep, the sun rose reluctantly, casting an eerie glow over the forest. It was the kind of morning that felt heavier than it should have been. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the stillness that surrounded us seemed unnatural. As we gathered around the campfire to make breakfast, no one spoke much. The usual banter was replaced with awkward glances and an unspoken tension. The events of the previous night lingered in the back of our minds, and we couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us into the woods. "All right, let's not get too paranoid," I said, trying to break the silence. "It was probably just an animal, like Tom said. A deer, or maybe a raccoon. I'm sure there's nothing to worry about." Everyone nodded, but there was no enthusiasm in their responses. It felt like we were trying to convince ourselves more than each other. Jack, who usually had a carefree attitude, seemed distant. His eyes kept scanning the tree line, his face tense as though waiting for something to appear. Ben, always the skeptic, was the first to stand up and attempt to shift the mood. "We're just overthinking it. I'll go grab some firewood. That should take our minds off it." He grabbed his axe and headed toward the tree line, his footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath him. Tom sighed, shaking his head. "We're all jumpy. It's just a forest, guys." We tried to move past it, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. As the morning went on, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows. The woods had an oppressive quality to them, as if they were alive in a way that was impossible to explain. The sunlight filtering through the canopy seemed to create strange, shifting patterns on the forest floor, and the trees felt closer, almost as though they were leaning in, watching us. The odd thing was, no one else seemed as aware of it as I was. Jack was still on edge, but he didn't say much. Laura was distracted by the forest's beauty, snapping pictures with her camera, seemingly unaffected by the strange atmosphere. Peter and Ben were chatting about the hiking trail they planned to explore later that day, and Tom was fiddling with his gear, trying to set up some sort of camp gadget he had brought along. It was as if the rest of the group was oblivious to the growing sense of something amiss. That was, until Ben returned. He came back to camp, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he dropped the bundle of firewood he had gathered. "You guys, you won't believe what I just saw." The rest of us stopped what we were doing, exchanging nervous glances. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was out by the edge of the trees," Ben said, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. "I was just picking up some dead branches when I saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the woods. It didn't move, just stood there. And then it was gone." "Ben, come on, man. You're just spooked from last night," Tom said, chuckling as if to dismiss the idea. "Probably just a deer or something." But Ben shook his head, his eyes wide with disbelief. "No, Tom. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't even human, not like any person I've ever seen. It was too tall, and its face was. It was strange. Like it didn't have any real features. Just pale, smooth skin. I don't know how to explain it." The group went silent. Tom's laughter died in his throat, and Jack looked at Ben with a mixture of confusion and concern. "You're sure you saw something?" Jack asked, his voice low. Ben nodded, swallowing hard. "I know what I saw." There was a long pause, the tension between us growing with each passing second. I could feel the air getting thicker, colder. Laura's camera hung loosely around her neck, her eyes wide, as though she were starting to understand that something wasn't right. "Well, maybe it was just a trick of the light," Peter suggested, though even he didn't sound entirely convinced. "I mean, the trees and shadows. They can play tricks on you." "Maybe," Ben said, but there was doubt in his voice. "But I don't think so. This wasn't a trick." The conversation died down after that, but the unsettling feeling lingered. We tried to focus on the day's activities, but nothing felt right anymore. The woods felt different, as though we were no longer visitors, but intruders. Every step we took seemed to echo louder than it should, and every crackling twig underfoot sounded like a warning. We went on a hike, just as we had planned, but the whole time, I felt like we were being watched. The trees around us seemed to stretch higher and higher, casting long shadows that grew as the day wore on. The air, which had once been warm and inviting, now felt suffocating. We trudged along the trail in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my senses on high alert. The forest seemed endless, the path winding in strange, almost unnatural ways. We'd passed the same large rock formation twice without realizing it. Ben, still visibly shaken, walked ahead, his pace quick and erratic, as though trying to escape something unseen. At one point, Jack and I lagged behind, the two of us walking together for a few moments while the others moved ahead. "You think Ben's telling the truth?" I asked, lowering my voice as we walked. "I don't know, man," Jack replied, looking around nervously. "It's hard to say, but there's definitely something weird about this place." I nodded. "Yeah, I feel it too." We stopped for a moment, taking in the surrounding woods. The trees loomed large, their branches twisting like gnarled hands reaching for the sky. The silence was overwhelming, almost suffocating. It felt like the forest was closing in on us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded deeper into its heart. As we continued on, the unease in the group grew. Laura, who had been distracted earlier, now seemed aware of the tension. Her eyes kept darting around, and I noticed her footsteps quickening, as though she wanted to get out of there as fast as we could. Peter, normally the most laid back of us all, kept looking over his shoulder, his face pale and drawn. Ben stopped suddenly, his breath catching in his throat. He pointed to a spot ahead of us. "There it is again," he said, his voice barely a whisper. We all turned to look. At the edge of the trees, barely visible between the thick trunks, was a shape, a figure, standing motionless, just as Ben had described earlier. It was tall, impossibly tall, with no real defining features. Its form was obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the sense that it was watching us, waiting. "Ben, what the hell is that?" Peter asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Ben replied, his voice cracking, "but I think it's been following us." We stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, as though it were observing us. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, dissolving into the trees like smoke. We all exchanged nervous glances, each of us too afraid to speak. "Okay," Jack said, swallowing hard. "I think we've seen enough." We didn't waste any time after that. We turned and headed back to camp, none of us saying a word. The woods felt colder now, the shadows longer, as though they were following us. That night, as we huddled around the campfire once more, the silence was deafening. No one spoke, each of us lost in our thoughts. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, but it did little to break the tension. We all knew that whatever we had seen, whatever was out there in the woods, it wasn't something that could be explained away. It wasn't a trick of the light, and it wasn't some animal. It was something far darker. As the days dragged on, the sense of unease that had settled in our group only intensified. What had started as a single, unsettling event, a figure in the woods, soon evolved into something far more sinister. The forest, which had once seemed like a peaceful retreat, now felt suffocating, oppressive, and alive with a menacing presence. The mornings came too soon, each one colder and quieter than the last. The sun barely peeked through the canopy of towering trees, casting everything beneath it in a dull, muted light. The once lush undergrowth had begun to look dry and brittle, and the birds, which had been so vocal in the beginning, had grown eerily silent. The forest no longer felt like a place of life, it felt like a place of decay, a forgotten world that had been abandoned by the sun. As we went about our daily routines, cooking, cleaning, and preparing for another hike, something always seemed off. It wasn't just the strange figure that Ben had seen. It was the way the trees seemed to bend inwards, the way the shadows grew too long, even in the early hours of the day. The air felt thick, heavy, and it was harder to breathe, as though the forest itself was tightening its grip around us. It wasn't long before more unsettling things started happening. On the second night after Ben's encounter, we had just finished eating dinner, when we heard the first sound that wasn't from our campfire or the distant rustling of leaves. It was a low, deep growl, far off in the trees. At first, we thought it was a bear, but this sound was different, too low, too guttural. It vibrated in our chests, setting our nerves on edge. "Probably just a bear," Tom said, but there was a tremor in his voice that wasn't there before. "Nothing to worry about." But we all knew better. Bears don't growl like that. And whatever it was, it sounded closer than wedlike. We stood in silence, listening as the growl faded away, only to be replaced by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving slowly through the woods. "What the hell is that?" Laura whispered, her voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping noticeably, and the wind kicked up, rustling the leaves in a way that felt far too aggressive. We tried to ignore it, to convince ourselves that it was just the wind playing tricks, but deep down, we all knew that something wasn't right. The next day, we decided to venture deeper into the woods, hoping that a change of scenery would help calm our nerves. We packed up some water and snacks and set off along the trail, which now seemed narrower and more overgrown than it had the day before. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like clawed fingers. It felt as though the forest was closing in around us, and each step we took only made the weight on our shoulders heavier. It wasn't long before we noticed more strange things. The forest floor, once covered in dry leaves and twigs, was now covered in a thick layer of damp moss, which seemed to grow at an unnatural rate. Every time we stopped to catch our breath, the moss seemed to spread beneath our feet, slowly creeping toward the edges of the trail. "I don't remember this being here yesterday," I muttered to no one in particular, bending down to touch the moss. It was cold, slick, and almost felt like it was moving under my fingers. "That's not normal," Ben said, his voice tight. "It's almost like it's alive." Laura shivered and glanced nervously around. "We need to get out of here." But we couldn't. We were already too far in, and turning back now would have felt like running, like admitting defeat to something we couldn't understand. So we pressed on. The deeper we went, the stranger things became. The trees seemed to grow thicker, their trunks twisting into unnatural shapes. At times, it felt as if they were reaching out to us, their limbs grasping at our arms and legs as we passed. The air grew thicker, and the distant sound of wind through the leaves became a low, almost mournful hum, like a voice singing just out of reach. But there were no birds, no insects, nothing that should have been there. At one point, we stopped to rest by a small clearing. I sat down on a large rock, trying to steady my breathing, when I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. A figure. It was standing at the far edge of the clearing, barely visible in the thick shadows. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but when I looked again, it was still there. "Guys," I whispered urgently. "There's something over there." Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the shadowy figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and just like Ben had described before, it was featureless, no face, no eyes, just an indistinct shape against the dark trees. "What is that?" Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't like this. Let's go. Now." We all turned to leave, but as we did, the figure moved. Not in a natural way, but in sudden, jerky motions, like it was being pulled by some unseen force. We couldn't look away as it slowly, painfully approached us, its movements unnatural, mechanical even. "Run!" Ben shouted, his voice cracking in fear. We didn't hesitate. We bolted back the way we came, stumbling over rocks and branches in our haste. My heart pounded in my chest as we ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind us, the figure remained, moving toward us with terrifying speed. The woods were no longer the same. Every step seemed to echo louder in the stillness, and the shadows twisted unnaturally as though they were alive. I could feel the figure getting closer, could hear its footsteps, heavy and deliberate, getting louder in my ears. We ran faster, the fear of being caught driving us forward. Eventually, we made it back to camp, breathless and shaken. We collapsed around the fire, trying to catch our breath. The figure, whatever it was, had stopped following us. But the fear remained, gnawing at our insides. "What the hell is going on?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jack said, his eyes wide. "But we need to leave. This place isn't normal. It's not safe." We all knew he was right, but something kept us there. A strange compulsion, like the forest had sunk its claws into us and wasn't going to let go. The days passed, each one darker and more suffocating than the last. Strange occurrences became more frequent. The growling noises in the night, the figures in the trees, the way the forest seemed to change around us. We began to notice strange markings on the trees, symbols carved into the bark in a language none of us recognized. The once familiar sounds of the forest were replaced by a strange hum, like a low, buzzing drone that never seemed to stop. Even the fire, when we sat around it at night, flickered erratically, as though it too was struggling against something unseen. And always, the shadows in the trees seemed to grow longer, darker, and more menacing. We tried to investigate. We walked deeper into the woods, trying to find the source of the strange noises and movements. But every time we ventured further in, it felt like the forest was closing in around us, as though we were being herded towards something. And the more we looked, the more the trees seemed to shift, to grow in ways that defied reason. I began to wonder if we were still in the same place, or if we were somehow being trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape. The more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest knew us, that it had always known we were coming. And as the days wore on, I realized we were no longer in control. The forest was now our master, and there was no way out. It was the fourth night, the air heavy with tension, the forest more oppressive than ever. The days we had spent in that place had blurred together into a haze of exhaustion, fear, and confusion. The strange occurrences had intensified, and now we were all walking on a razor's edge, barely holding it together. The shadows in the woods had grown longer, and the silence had become deafening. It was no longer just the sound of our own breathing that disturbed the air. It was the unsettling knowledge that we were being watched. We weren't alone anymore. That night, something changed. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like an animal in pain, rattling the branches above us. The firelight flickered erratically, casting strange, dancing shadows across our faces. It wasn't just the forest that felt alive. It was the air, the earth beneath our feet, and the very fire that crackled before us. Everything seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a pulse that was quickening, growing stronger. We sat in tense silence around the campfire, knowing that whatever had been lingering in the woods for days was now closing in. We could feel it. Whatever was coming, it was going to be worse than anything we'd encountered so far. "I can't take it anymore," Laura whispered, her voice cracking. She had been quiet all day, her face pale, her eyes wide. She was the first to speak, but none of us had the words. We all felt it, the heaviness in the air, the sense that something terrible was about to unfold. Ben, who had been the most determined to stay calm, looked around, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "We need to stay calm. We'll be okay," he said, but his voice was hollow, as if he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. But deep down, we knew it wasn't true. The forest was not okay. We were not okay. A sharp crack echoed from the woods, louder than any branch snapping underfoot. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. That sound wasn't natural. It didn't belong to the forest. And then came the footsteps. They were not the soft, hesitant steps of animals moving through the brush. No, these were deliberate, heavy footsteps, the sound of something, or someone, moving through the undergrowth with purpose. And it was moving toward us. My stomach twisted into a knot. We weren't imagining it. Something was out there, coming closer. "I hear it too," Tom muttered, barely able to mask the terror in his voice. "We're not alone." We were paralyzed with fear. No one moved, no one spoke. The footsteps drew closer, each step sending a ripple of dread through the group. I could feel the tension building, every muscle in my body coiled, ready to spring into action, though I wasn't sure what action would even help. And then, out of the dark, it appeared. At first, it was a blur, a dark shape in the distance. But as it moved closer, its form became more defined, more solid. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I realized what it was. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could recognize. Its body was unnaturally tall and thin, its movements jerky and distorted, as if its limbs were being pulled by invisible strings. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless expanse where one should be. And the way it moved, oh God, the way it moved, it wasn't right. It seemed to glide, its feet barely touching the ground, and yet it was gaining speed, getting closer with each agonizing second. The figure was close now, too close. I could see the details more clearly. Its arms were too long, hanging unnaturally by its sides, and its legs were bent at odd angles, as if they didn't belong. And its skin, it wasn't skin at all. It was a dark, slick, almost liquid surface, stretching and pulling as it moved. It seemed to ripple like water, catching the dim light of the fire and casting eerie reflections on its form. Tom was the first to react, stumbling backward as his voice broke out in a terrified scream. "What is that?" His words were sharp and full of panic, the terror evident in his eyes. The rest of us were frozen in place, unable to look away, unable to move. The figure had stopped just at the edge of the firelight, its distorted body flickering in and out of focus, as if it couldn't quite decide where it wanted to be. It stood there, watching us. I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me. My mind screamed for me to run, to do something, but my body betrayed me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Then the air around us grew colder. It wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was as if the cold was alive, wrapping itself around us, freezing us to the bone. I could see my breath misting in front of me, thick and white, as if the very atmosphere had turned to ice. The fire flickered wildly, casting strange shadows that danced around us in impossible shapes. And then the creature moved. Slowly at first, and then faster, it glided toward us, its head tilting in a way that was entirely unnatural. There was no expression, no sign of emotion, but I could feel its gaze, could feel it searching us. It was as if it was studying us, deciding which one of us to take, to consume. Ben's voice broke the silence, though it was barely a whisper. "We have to go. Now." But it was too late. The figure lunged, faster than anything should have been able to move, and everything went black. When I came to, I was no longer sitting by the fire. I was lying on the cold forest floor, the damp earth pressing into my skin. My heart was still racing, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. But there was something wrong. Everything was wrong. The forest around me felt different. The trees were twisted, their branches reaching down toward me like skeletal hands. The ground was no longer solid beneath me. It was soft, like mud, sucking at my feet as if it wanted to pull me under. And then I remembered. The creature, the way it had moved, the way it had watched us. It was no longer just a figure in the dark. It had been something far worse, something ancient and hungry, a presence that had been waiting in the depths of the woods. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking, and looked around. The others, where were they? I called out, but my voice was lost in the oppressive silence of the forest. There was no answer. I stumbled through the woods, my heart pounding in my chest, calling their names. But all I heard was the crackling of the leaves beneath my feet. And then, in the distance, I heard something else, something worse than the silence. A laugh. A low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then, I knew. We were never supposed to leave. I don't know how much time passed. I had lost track of it in the moments of sheer panic and chaos, as my mind struggled to make sense of the horrors it just witnessed. The others were gone. I called for them, my voice hoarse from screaming, but there was no reply. Only that low, mocking laugh echoed through the forest, distant and yet too close at the same time. I had to move. I had to find a way out. Stumbling through the underbrush, my hands scraped against the rough bark of trees, my feet tangled in roots and brambles. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that place any longer. I couldn't face whatever that creature was, whatever it had done to my friends. I couldn't let it take me too. I ran. I pushed myself harder, my heart pounding as I gasped for breath. The forest was closing in around me, the trees becoming thicker, the shadows darker. It felt like the woods themselves were shifting, moving in ways that didn't make sense. Every step I took seemed to draw me deeper into their grasp. There was no escape, no way to outrun the nightmare that was chasing me. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going, my legs screaming for rest, my mind clouded with fear. But then, through the trees, I saw something that made my heart leap. A clearing, the outline of the cabin where we'd started our trip. My hope surged, but it was quickly replaced with dread. The cabin, our safe place, was now just a hollow shell. It was as if it had been abandoned for years, the walls sagging, the windows shattered, and the door hanging off its hinges. I approached cautiously, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But something inside me pushed forward, urging me to reach the cabin. Maybe it was the hope that someone, anyone, was still there. Maybe it was desperation. As I reached the threshold, I froze. The air inside the cabin was thick, heavy, as if it had been sealed off for an eternity. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched into the wood, some of them recent, some of them worn away with time. They were the same symbols I had seen in my dreams, the ones that had haunted me since I first entered the woods. The same markings that had filled the air with that oppressive weight, the ones that seemed to be calling out to me, guiding me, drawing me into the forest's heart. I stepped inside, my breath shallow, my eyes darting around the room. The furniture was overturned, the fireplace cold and empty. But there, in the center of the room, something caught my eye. It was a figure, a person. No, not a person, an entity. The same grotesque shape I had seen in the woods. It was standing in the middle of the room, its head tilted as it watched me with that same empty gaze. For a moment, time seemed to slow. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. The creature seemed to be studying me, analyzing me in the same way it had with my friends. It knew everything. Then, without warning, it lunged forward, its long, twisted limbs reaching out for me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but I was too slow. The creature's hand wrapped around my wrist, its touch cold and slick, like ice against my skin. It wasn't just physical, it was inside my mind, digging into my thoughts, pulling them apart piece by piece. My vision blurred as the world around me began to distort. The walls of the cabin seemed to warp and twist, the floor beneath my feet giving way to shadows. The creature was laughing now, its laugh echoing in my ears, reverberating through the very air. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The creature released its grip, its form flickering in and out of existence. The forest outside seemed to grow quieter, the wind stilling for a moment. I fell to the ground, gasping for air, my mind a jumble of confusion and terror. What had just happened? Was it real? The creature was gone, but I wasn't alone. A figure appeared in the doorway of the cabin. It was Ben. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't speak at first, his gaze darting nervously around the room. "It's not over," he said, his voice shaking. I shook my head, not understanding. "What do you mean? What happened? Where's everyone else?" He stepped forward, his hands trembling. "We were all taken. Each of us. But But we didn't leave. Not really. I tried to process his words, but my mind was clouded with exhaustion and fear. Ben continued, his voice trembling. The forest isn't what it seems. It's not just a place. It's something else. Something ancient. It traps you, takes you, and once you're in its grip, there's no way out. My head spun. The weight of his words sank in, and I understood. The forest wasn't just a forest. It was something alive, something powerful and ancient. And it had claimed us. We have to leave, I said, my voice urgent. Now, before it comes back. Ben didn't argue. He just nodded, his face drawn and tired, as if the same realization had hit him too. We both turned to leave the cabin, stepping back into the oppressive darkness of the forest. But as we walked, I could feel it. The presence, the weight. The forest hadn't let us go. We were still trapped, and we always would be. We didn't speak after that. There were no more words to say. We kept walking, moving through the woods as the shadows grew longer and the laughter grew louder until it was all I could hear. It wasn't over. And I knew, deep down, it would never be over. Days passed, or was it weeks? Time had become irrelevant in that place. The once clear-cut boundaries of night and day had dissolved, and now there was only the endless, oppressive darkness of the forest. I had long since lost track of everything. The passage of time, the lives we had left behind, and even the concept of what it meant to be free. Ben and I moved through the woods in silence, the weight of what we had endured still fresh in our minds. The forest, as if it were alive, continued to close in around us. It felt as though the trees themselves were watching, their twisted branches reaching down like fingers, ready to drag us back into the heart of the nightmare. It didn't matter where we went. The forest seemed to follow us, bending around our every move, pulling us deeper into its suffocating grip. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the sense of dread grew with every turn. We both knew it wasn't going to let us go. The creature, or whatever it was that had haunted us, wasn't finished. It was waiting for us, lurking just out of sight, waiting to finish what it had started. I could hear its laugh in the distance, taunting us, echoing through the trees like a mocking reminder of our helplessness. The fear had become a constant companion, gnawing at my insides, twisting my thoughts, until all I could think about was escape, getting away from this place, this living nightmare that refused to release us. But there was no escape. I glanced at Ben as we walked, and for the first time, I saw the same hopelessness in his eyes that I felt. We had both known, deep down, that there was no way out of the forest. The creature had already taken us. We were its prisoners, and we had no hope of being free. We were stuck in an endless loop, condemned to wander these cursed woods forever. Do you ever wonder if we're already dead? Ben's voice broke the silence, and I turned to face him. His face was pale, gaunt, as if the terror had aged him beyond recognition. He was a shell of the person he used to be. I don't know, I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. I don't know if any of this is real anymore. The thought of it hit me like a wave. What if we had never left the woods? What if this was all some twisted dream, some illusion that kept us trapped in a never-ending cycle of terror? We had seen things, heard things, felt things that no one should have to endure. But perhaps the real horror was not what we had seen, but the realization that we had never truly escaped. We walked for what felt like hours, the silence stretching between us like an insurmountable distance. The sounds of the forest, once a distant background hum, now seemed to be amplified. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves, every gust of wind felt like a threat. It was as if the forest itself was closing in on us, suffocating us with its oppressive weight. And then, as if it had been waiting for this moment, the creature appeared again. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes. It stood in the distance, shrouded in darkness, its grotesque form barely visible through the trees. But I could feel its presence, feel the malicious intent radiating off of it like a suffocating cloud. The air grew colder, and I could hear the low rumble of its laugh, a sound that seemed to come from all directions at once, wrapping around us like a vice. It moved toward us, slowly, deliberately, its twisted limbs swaying with every step. I could see its eyes now, dark, empty voids that stared at me with an intensity that pierced through to my soul. I could feel the weight of its gaze, like it was inside my mind, sifting through my thoughts, stripping away my will. Ben froze, his body trembling with fear. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. We were paralyzed by the creature's presence, as though it had us in some sort of trance. Run! Ben's voice broke through the fog of terror. It was weak, strained, but it carried a sense of urgency that cut through the fear. Run now. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Ben's arm, and together we turned and fled, our feet pounding against the forest floor as we sprinted away from the creature. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trees bending and shifting in ways that defied logic. But no matter how fast we ran, no matter how hard we pushed ourselves, it felt like the forest was always just one step behind us, one breath away from consuming us whole. We reached the clearing again, the one where the cabin had stood. But now it was nothing more than a dark, empty space. The cabin was gone, swallowed up by the forest, leaving only the remnants of its former existence. The air was thick with the same oppressive presence that had haunted us from the very beginning. There was no escape. Ben and I stood there, panting, drenched in sweat, our bodies shaking with exhaustion and fear. We had reached the end. There was nowhere else to run, nowhere else to hide. And then I saw it. The creature, standing just beyond the clearing, its form flickering in and out of existence, its eyes locked onto mine. It was smiling, or at least, I think it was. The expression on its face was so twisted, so alien, that it was hard to even call it a smile. It was more of a grimace, a distortion of something that might have once resembled human emotion. I told you, its voice echoed through the forest, a hollow, haunting sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You'll never leave. You belong to the woods now. And with that, I understood. We were never meant to leave. The forest had claimed us, body and soul, and we were now part of its dark, eternal web. There was no escape, no salvation. We were bound to the woods, to the creature that ruled it, to the nightmare that had consumed us. As I stood there, staring into the darkness, I felt the last shred of my humanity slip away. I was no longer a person. I was part of the forest now, part of the terror that had gripped it. The creature's laughter filled the air, and I knew, with chilling certainty, that this was my new reality, and I would never escape. It was a regular Thursday night when I first stepped into the hospital. The kind of night you don't expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. I had just finished my shift at a nearby clinic and had been asked to fill in for a nurse at this old hospital just outside town. Nothing unusual about that, right? After all, I was used to the routine. It worked in several hospitals before, but this one, well, it was different. The hospital, located in a secluded part of town, was known for its age. It had been there for decades, long before the newer, more modern hospitals were built on the outskirts of the city. The building itself was a large, imposing structure, with towering brick walls and windows that almost looked like eyes staring out from the darkness. The moment I pulled into the parking lot, I felt a slight chill in the air, but I brushed it off. It was just the cold of the night settling in. Inside, the smell was stale, mixed with the usual antiseptic scent you'd expect from a hospital. But there was something more to it, a heaviness, almost suffocating. I walked through the empty halls, hearing the echo of my footsteps, each one bouncing off the cold tile floors. The hospital was strangely quiet, with only the distant hum of the air conditioning and the occasional clink of metal coming from the staff area. I met the head nurse, a woman named Clara. She had been working there for years, longer than anyone else in the building, and she greeted me with a calm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's good to have you on board tonight," she said, her voice smooth but strangely hollow. I nodded, though I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as she led me down the narrow hallway to my assigned station. The hospital was divided into several wings, but the one I was working in tonight was on the far end, near the old, unused part of the building. "This is where you'll be tonight," Clara said as we stopped outside a small room. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with a few fluorescent lights flickering overhead. There was a bed in the center, empty for now, and a chair by the window where I would spend most of my night. The walls were lined with old medical charts and outdated equipment. It wasn't the most pleasant space, but it worked in worse. As I settled into the chair, Clara gave me one last look before leaving, her footsteps echoing down the hall as she disappeared into the distance. The night was uneventful for the first few hours. I watched the clock tick by slowly, my eyelids growing heavier as the minutes dragged on. The hospital felt peaceful, almost too quiet, but I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was just the isolation of the place, or the fact that I hadn't seen any patients yet. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I wasn't used to this kind of stillness. Even in the most remote parts of the city, hospitals were usually bustling with activity. Here, though, it felt as if time had stopped altogether. As the night wore on, the quiet grew heavier, and the sense of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach only grew stronger. As I sat there, half watching the clock and half drifting off to sleep, something strange happened. The lights flickered again, and I thought I saw a shadow pass by the door. It was quick, so quick that I thought I had imagined it. I rubbed my eyes and looked around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. I shook my head, telling myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. The stillness was making me paranoid, that was all. But as the hours ticked by, I began to notice more oddities, little things that seemed off, though I couldn't explain why. The temperature in the room would fluctuate suddenly, from a comfortable warmth to an unnerving chill. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to become louder, more oppressive, and I could have sworn I heard footsteps when no one was around. But it was still early. I couldn't let my imagination run wild. I tried to stay focused, hoping the night would pass quickly so I could get back to my usual routine at the clinic. As the clock struck midnight, I glanced at the hallway outside my room. The dim, flickering lights made the shadows dance across the walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was watching me. It was then that I heard it. The faintest sound of breathing. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder, closer. My heart skipped a beat as I turned toward the door, my mind racing with possibilities. I got up from my chair, my legs feeling heavy as I walked toward the door. I pressed my ear to the cool metal, listening intently. The sound was unmistakable now, a slow, deliberate breath, as if someone were standing just outside, waiting. I slowly opened the door, the creak of the hinges echoing in the quiet. I peered down the hallway, but there was no one there. Just the same empty corridor I had seen a few minutes ago. I stepped back, my pulse quickening, and closed the door behind me. I sat back down in the chair, trying to calm myself, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't leave. The room felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. I tried to focus on my work, but the unease continued to grow. I glanced at the clock again. 1 hour had passed since the breathing sound, an hour that felt like a lifetime. It wasn't until later that night, when the events took a darker turn, that I realized the true nature of the hospital. It wasn't just a quiet, eerie place. It was a place that held its own secrets. Secrets that, for some reason, had been waiting for me. Little did I know, the night was far from over, and the strange occurrences would soon escalate into something far more terrifying than I could ever have imagined. The hospital was still as unnerving as it had been earlier, but I tried to keep my focus on the task at hand. I was used to night shifts, and had grown accustomed to the long stretches of silence, the feeling of isolation that sometimes came with being the only person on the floor. But this place, there was something about it that was different. It was hard to explain, but I felt it in the air, in the way the silence hung heavy in the rooms, pressing down on me like a weight. It was nearly 2 a.m. when the first real sign that something was wrong came. I had been sitting at my post, occasionally checking the monitor to make sure everything was running smoothly in the empty room. The hallway outside remained as still as ever, the dim lights flickering every now and then. My eyelids were starting to feel heavy, and I had begun to drift off when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it might be one of the other staff members coming down the hall, but when I looked out into the corridor, there was no one in sight. I frowned, my heart rate quickening slightly. I listened intently, straining my ears for any other sounds. But nothing. It was quiet again. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. The hospital was old. After all, old buildings had their creaks and groans, especially in the dead of night. I went back to my seat, determined to focus on the job. But just as I was about to settle in again, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of someone breathing, slow, shallow breaths, coming from the hallway. This time, it was louder, closer. My stomach tightened, and I got up from the chair, walking to the door again. I stood there, frozen for a moment, before slowly pushing the door open. My eyes scanned the hallway in front of me. The flickering lights cast long shadows on the walls, but the corridor was empty. There was no one there. The sound of breathing had stopped, and everything seemed to return to its unnatural quiet. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was just my nerves getting the best of me. I hadn't had a full night's sleep in days, and it was starting to catch up with me. But as I turned back to the room, my eyes caught something strange. On the floor near the door, there was a smear of dark liquid. I knelt down to get a closer look, my stomach flipping as I realized it wasn't water. It wasn't any kind of liquid I could recognize. It was a deep, dark red. My mind raced as I looked around the hallway again, checking the walls, the floor, the ceiling. There was no sign of a spill. There was no indication that anyone had been here recently. No patient. No staff member. Just the blood stain, fresh and unmistakable. I reached out to touch it, but before my fingers could make contact, the lights flickered again, and the room suddenly felt colder. My breath caught in my throat. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I quickly stood up and backed away from the stain, my heart racing. There was something deeply wrong about this, something that I couldn't quite put into words. I took a moment to collect myself. It was just blood, right? There was no reason to panic. It could have been from a prior incident, something that hadn't been cleaned up. But the fact that it was so fresh, that was what unsettled me. I looked down the hallway one last time. Still no sign of anyone. I quickly closed the door to the room and locked it, even though I knew it probably wouldn't do much good. This was a hospital, after all. The rooms were designed to be easy to get into in case of emergencies. I sat back down in the chair, trying to calm my thoughts. The blood stain didn't make sense. The whole thing didn't make sense. Was I just seeing things? Had I imagined it? No, it had been there, real and undeniable. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been here, and I was being watched. The hours passed slowly after that. My eyes kept darting to the door, to the hallway outside. The stillness felt suffocating, and every little sound made me jump. The hum of the air conditioning, the faint creak of the old building settling, it all seemed to take on an eerie significance, like the building itself was alive and aware of my presence. Around 4 a.m., I heard a loud bang. It came from down the hall, from one of the old rooms that hadn't been used in years. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The bang sounded like something heavy had fallen, but when I looked out into the hallway again, there was no sign of anything unusual. Nothing had moved, nothing had fallen. It was as if the sound had come from nowhere. I took a deep breath and went down the hall to investigate, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. As I neared the source of the sound, I noticed that the door to one of the old rooms was ajar, slightly cracked open. It wasn't a patient's room. It was one of the storage rooms, a place I had been told to avoid. The last time anyone had been in there was months ago, and the staff had told me that the room was off limits due to old equipment that hadn't been used in years. But now, the door was open. I stood there for a moment, debating whether or not to go inside. I could hear nothing now, only the faint hum of the air conditioning. There was no sign of anyone inside the room, but the door was wide enough for me to see the faint outline of something on the floor, a shadow in the corner. My curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The room smelled musty, like dust and forgotten things. Old boxes and medical equipment were stacked haphazardly around the room, but there was nothing out of the ordinary at first glance. It wasn't until I looked down that I saw it, the same dark red liquid, pooling on the floor beneath the shelves. I froze. It was the same stain, the same blood. My stomach turned as I realized that this wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. Someone, or something, had been here. I backed away slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard something, a voice, barely a whisper, just out of reach. It sounded like a call for help, a faint, desperate plea. I bolted out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it was something I wasn't ready to face. I returned to my station, locking the door behind me and sitting back down, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to calm myself, but the events of the night had already begun to unravel my nerves. The blood, the footsteps, the whispering voice, it was all too much. I was no longer alone in this place. Something else was here, and it was watching me, waiting for me to discover whatever it was that lay hidden in the shadows of the hospital's old halls. The tension in the hospital seemed to grow stronger each passing minute. The once familiar halls had become a maze of uncertainty, their long stretches of empty space now heavy with something dark and oppressive. At first, I had brushed off the strange occurrences, the footsteps, the eerie breathing, the bloodstains, as tricks of my mind, a combination of exhaustion and the quiet isolation of the night shift. But it was becoming harder to ignore. It had been 3 days since the bloodstain first appeared, and I found myself on edge more than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced down the hallway, every time I opened a door, there was something lurking just out of sight, something waiting for me to find it. My routine had started to fall apart, and I couldn't focus on my work anymore. The strange events had become more frequent, more impossible to dismiss as coincidence. I was in the break room, sitting at one of the small tables, when I heard it again, those unmistakable footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, echoing down the hall just outside the room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were getting closer. I held my breath, listening intently. But when I peeked out from behind the door, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the flickering lights casting long shadows against the walls. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what was happening. The fear that had been gnawing at me for days had finally reached its breaking point. I had to investigate. I couldn't keep pretending that nothing was wrong. I walked down the hallway, the silence around me now deafening. The walls, once so sterile and familiar, now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. The scent of antiseptic was overpowering, but it didn't feel clean anymore. It felt suffocating, like it was trying to drown me. Each step I took seemed to reverberate in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just behind me, waiting to reach out and grab me. I reached the old storage room again, the one where I had found the bloodstain just days before. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been when I first discovered it. I hesitated for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. This time, I wasn't sure I was ready to face whatever lay inside. But my curiosity, my need for answers, pushed me forward. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was darker than before, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. The faint smell of decay lingered in the air, mingling with the dust and the mildew. The shelves, stacked high with forgotten equipment, seemed to groan under the weight of years of neglect. But it wasn't the disarray of the room that caught my attention. It was the feeling. The overwhelming sensation that something was wrong, that something was watching me from the corners of the room. I scanned the space, my eyes darting across the clutter. And then I saw it, the blood. It was fresh again, pooling in the same spot where I had seen it days before. The sight made my stomach twist, but it was the next thing that truly unsettled me. Something had been written in the blood, though it was faint and difficult to make out. I leaned closer, my eyes straining to decipher the strange markings. It wasn't until I was inches away that I could see it clearly. Letters. Letters smeared across the floor, the blood so dark it looked almost black. It wasn't a message I recognized, just a series of strange, jagged shapes. But the feeling I had when I saw them was undeniable, a sense of urgency, of desperation. I backed away from the stain, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing, and I didn't want to. Every part of me screamed to leave, to get out of this place before whatever was haunting it could do any more damage. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. The need to understand, to uncover the truth, kept me tethered to that room. And then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat as I grabbed the door handle. It wouldn't budge. It was locked, just like that night when I had first discovered it. I twisted the handle again and again, panic rising in my chest as I struggled to get the door open. My hands were shaking, my heart racing, but no matter how hard I pulled, the door refused to move. I was trapped. I tried to force myself to stay calm, but the air in the room was suffocating. It felt colder now, the temperature dropping so rapidly that I could see my breath clouding in front of me. The faint hum of the hospital's ventilation system grew louder, almost deafening, and the lights flickered overhead. My pulse quickened, and I could feel my mind starting to spiral. Then I heard a soft, scraping sound from somewhere behind me, like nails dragging across the floor. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the shadows. The room was empty, there was nothing there. But the sound persisted, closer now, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wasn't alone. I could hear the breathing again, that shallow, labored breath that I had heard on the first night. It was coming from behind the stacks of old boxes. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Something was there, moving in the dark. I took a step back, my body shaking as I struggled to keep my composure. The scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, and I felt my throat close up. I had to get out. I had to escape before whatever was in here with me found me. But the door remained locked, and I was trapped in this room with whatever was haunting the hospital. Suddenly, the room went silent. The scraping stopped. The breathing stopped. For a moment, it was as if the world had stopped spinning. I stood there, motionless, straining my ears to listen for any sound, but there was nothing. I slowly turned around, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the doorway, just beyond the shadow of the room, silhouetted by the dim light. I could barely make out the shape, but there was something about it that made my blood run cold. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its outline seemed to shift like it wasn't quite real. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were dark voids, blacker than the shadows surrounding it. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, and the air grew colder still. The temperature was plummeting now, and the frost on the walls was creeping closer, inch by inch. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing but the cold, the silence, and the oppressive weight of its absence. I was left in the room, alone, but I knew I wasn't really alone. Something was here with me, something that would not let me go. I had to get out. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something else. The strange blood markings on the floor, they had changed. The jagged shapes had shifted, rearranged into something new, something I couldn't comprehend. A message. A warning? It didn't matter. I had to escape before I became a part of it, before whatever was lurking in this hospital claimed me, too. I stumbled back toward the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the handle. It finally gave way, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. But as I looked down the long corridor, I knew deep in my gut that the worst was far from over. The hospital had become something else entirely, and whatever was inside, whatever had been watching me, was just getting started. It had only been a few minutes since I escaped from the storage room, but it felt like hours. The halls of the hospital stretched out before me, long and empty, as though I were walking through a nightmare that I could never wake from. The lights flickered above me, casting eerie shadows across the walls, and every step I took seemed to echo in the hollow silence, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The fear I had been carrying since the first strange incident had grown into a full-blown panic now. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay here anymore. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place before whatever was haunting it caught up to me. But as I turned the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, tall, still, and unmoving. It was a silhouette at first, a dark shape against the faint glow of the emergency lights. But as I stepped forward, I saw it clearly. The figure was wearing a hospital gown, its body gaunt and emaciated, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. The face, it was the face that I had been seeing in my nightmares. It was my face. The figure's eyes were hollow, black voids, but there was a twisted familiarity to it, something I couldn't quite place. It stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I felt my stomach churn as the cold air grew colder, as though the very atmosphere around me was closing in, squeezing the life out of me. My first instinct was to run, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. My mind screamed at me to escape, to leave, but I was frozen in place, trapped in the grip of something beyond my understanding. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The hospital gown it wore fluttered faintly in the air, and its footsteps seemed to echo in the empty hallway, louder and louder. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it approach, my body trembling uncontrollably. And then it spoke. "Why did you come back?" The voice was hoarse, like something dragged from the depths of the earth. It sounded like mine, but warped, distorted, as if someone had twisted the very essence of my being. I wanted to speak, to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't move. My eyes were fixed on that figure, unable to look away. "Why did you come back here?" it repeated, its voice rising in intensity, shaking the very walls around us. I opened my mouth, but no sound escaped. I wanted to ask it what it meant, what was going on, but I couldn't form the words. The figure's dark eyes bore into me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was staring into the very heart of something evil, something ancient, something beyond my comprehension. The air grew heavier, thicker, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. The hallway stretched out endlessly before me, the shadows growing longer with each passing second. I wanted to run, to break free, but the figure was blocking my path, its gaze locked onto mine as though it were waiting for something. Suddenly, the floor beneath me trembled, a deep, guttural vibration that shook the walls and rattled the lights overhead. I looked around, but there was nothing, just the figure, still moving closer, its presence overwhelming. My heart raced as the fear inside me reached its peak, and I felt a sickening realization settle in. There was no escape. The figure raised its hand, its fingers long and twisted, like claws reaching for me. I could see the bones beneath the skin, the flesh stretched tight, and I felt a chill that cut straight to my bones. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but the words were trapped in my throat, strangled by the terror that consumed me. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure whispered, its voice low and raspy, as though it was coming from far away. "This place doesn't forget. It never forgets." I didn't understand. What was it talking about? What was this place? Why was it after me? The figure took another step forward, and in that moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just my face. It was my reflection, twisted and distorted. I could see the blood stains on my own hands, the hollow eyes, the emptiness that had begun to seep into my very soul. I wasn't just seeing the figure anymore. I was seeing myself. The world around me seemed to crumble, the walls warping and bending as though the building itself was coming undone. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me as the terror gripped me with an iron fist. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even scream. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against my face, cold as ice. I flinched at the touch, but it was too late. The moment its hand made contact, a surge of images and memories flooded my mind. Visions of the hospital, of the patients, of the dark history that had been buried here for years. I saw faces I didn't recognize, people I had never met, all of them lost to the hospital's twisted grasp. The blood, the bodies, the whispers, it was all connected. All of it was tied to this place. And then, in an instant, it was gone. The figure vanished, as though it had never been there at all. The hospital was silent once more, the air thick with the remnants of its presence. My heart still pounded in my chest, my body trembling from the shock of what had just happened. But I wasn't alone. The voice echoed in my mind, whispering, "This place doesn't forget." I tried to push myself to my feet, but the ground seemed to shift beneath me, as if the hospital itself was alive, pulsing with a dark energy. I couldn't escape it. There was no way out. And then I understood. The hospital had never been haunted by the dead. It was haunted by something far worse. Something that fed on fear, on desperation, on the souls of the living. And now it had claimed me. In that moment, as I stood there, unable to move, unable to scream, I realized the truth. The hospital wasn't a place of healing. It was a place of torment. A place where the broken souls of the past lingered, waiting for new victims to take their place. And I was one of them now. As the darkness closed in around me, I finally understood the real horror of this place. It wasn't the ghostly figures, the bloodstains, or the whispers in the walls. It was the realization that the hospital itself was alive, feeding on the fear of those who dared to step inside. And as the world around me twisted and warped, I knew one thing for certain. There was no escaping it. There was no going back. This hospital had claimed me. I stumbled toward the exit, if I could even call it that, praying that the doors would be unlocked, that I would find some way out of this nightmare. But the closer I got to the front doors, the more I felt it. The presence, the dark force that had been stalking me. It was still there, just out of sight, pulling at the edges of my mind. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking as I tried to push it open. but it wouldn't budge. Locked. Of course, it was locked. I turned back, my panic escalating. Every single step I took seemed to echo through the empty halls. I could feel the cold air around me, pressing in like a vice. The hospital, or whatever it had become, wasn't letting me go. It had its grip on me, tighter and tighter with each passing second. But then, I remembered something. The back door. The maintenance entrance. It had always been open. And with a jolt of hope, I sprinted down the corridor. My breath ragged, my legs weak, but I pushed through, my mind consumed with the thought of escape. The back door wasn't far, just a few more turns down the hallway. I could see the dim light from the exit sign up ahead. My pulse quickened, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to hope. As I reached the door, I tried the handle, and this time, it turned. A rush of relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. When I stepped outside into the cold night air, the world around me felt wrong. The buildings stood still, too still. The streets were empty, eerily quiet. There were no cars, no distant sounds of life, just the distant hum of the city far away. I paused, staring at the night sky, the stars glimmering in the cold. For a brief moment, I thought that perhaps I had escaped. But something was different. Something was missing. It took me a moment to understand. The hospital, the building I had just fled from, it wasn't there anymore. It was gone. In its place was an empty lot, the ground cracked and overgrown with weeds, the remnants of what had once been a structure, now nothing more than a faded memory. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the empty space in disbelief. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. I blinked hard, trying to make sense of it. Had I been hallucinating? Had everything that had happened been some twisted product of my exhausted mind? But no. I knew what I had seen. I could still feel it. The fear. The darkness that had permeated that place. I walked slowly into the lot, my footsteps heavy and uncertain, until I reached the spot where the hospital had once stood. I could almost hear the echoes of those terrible memories, the whispers of the souls trapped within the walls of that cursed building. But as I stood there, something pulled at the back of my mind. I wasn't alone. There was something watching me, something in the air, pressing in around me. I could feel its presence, even if I couldn't see it. My body tensed, and I turned around, expecting to find the hospital looming behind me, but there was nothing. Nothing but empty streets. And then, out of nowhere, I heard a voice. "You can't escape." The words were soft, barely a whisper, but they froze me to my core. My eyes darted around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one. Just the empty lot and the vacant city streets. But I knew the truth now. The hospital hadn't let me go. It hadn't released me. It had followed me. The darkness, the malevolent force that had taken root in that building, it was still here. It had attached itself to me, and there was no escaping it. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the ground, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it get me again. As I ran, the world around me seemed to blur, my thoughts spinning in a chaotic whirlpool. I didn't know what was real anymore. I didn't know what had happened to that hospital or why I had been the one to witness its horrors. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Or had I truly been trapped in a nightmare far worse than anything I could comprehend? But one thing was certain. I couldn't run forever. Eventually, it would catch up to me. It always did. I stopped, gasping for air, and looked around. There was no sign of the hospital, no sign of anything unusual. It was as if the night had swallowed everything whole, leaving only the silence behind. But the silence was worse than any noise. It was a void, a deep, suffocating emptiness that pressed in on me from all sides. And then, just as I was about to turn and keep running, I saw it. A shadow in the corner of my eye. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but again, there was nothing. Only the quiet streets stretching out into the distance. But then I heard it again, the whisper, louder this time. You can't escape. It was a cold, chilling voice, and I knew without a doubt that it wasn't a figment of my imagination. The darkness had followed me, and now it was here, in the world, in the streets, and it wasn't going to let me go. It had me. It had claimed me, and it wasn't about to release me. Not now. Not ever. And so, I ran. But deep down, I knew it was pointless. There was nowhere to escape to. The darkness was all around me. I ran, but the reality of my situation had finally set in. No matter how fast I moved, no matter how far I traveled, the presence, the darkness, would always be right behind me. There was nowhere left to go. I had left the hospital, fled the building, but it hadn't left me. That feeling of being watched, the sense of something always hovering just out of sight, had never truly gone away. I had thought at first that escaping the physical space would be enough, that the nightmare would fade if I just outran it. But I was wrong. Every step I took, every corner I rounded, I could feel it growing stronger. That presence, the shadow that I had glimpsed on the streets, was now no longer just a whisper in the distance. It was with me. It clung to me like a second skin, tightening with every breath I took. I could feel it crawling under my flesh, in my blood, through my veins. It had attached itself to me, and I realized then, too late, that there was no escaping it. I hadn't understood before, but I understood now. The hospital had never been just a building. It was a place, yes, but it was more than that. It was a wound in the fabric of the world, a rip in reality where something terrible had taken root. It was a place of suffering, of memories that couldn't die. A place where the lines between the living and the dead had blurred. And it had consumed me, just as it had consumed everyone who had crossed its threshold. As I stumbled through the desolate streets, a cold, suffocating silence surrounded me. The city had emptied out. No more cars, no more people. It was as though the entire world had withdrawn, leaving me alone with whatever force had followed me. I turned to look over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone trailing behind me, but there was nothing but the oppressive quiet that seemed to stretch forever. I had to stop. I couldn't keep running. The exhaustion in my legs, the tightness in my chest, the rawness in my throat, all of it had reached its limit. There was no point in going on. I slumped to the ground, my back pressed against a building, as I tried to catch my breath. Sweat coated my skin, and my pulse hammered in my ears. The darkness seemed to press closer, suffocating me, but I couldn't tear myself away from it. It was everywhere now. I closed my eyes, my mind racing as I searched for some sort of escape, a way out of this nightmare. But all I found was more of the same, the cold, the silence, and the overwhelming sensation that I was being consumed from the inside out. I had tried to make sense of it all. I had tried to find answers, to understand why this was happening, but nothing made sense. The hospital had been abandoned, yes, but I wasn't free. It was as though the building, the dark force within it, had a life of its own. And now, I was nothing more than a vessel, a conduit for its unrelenting presence. I couldn't see it, couldn't touch it, but I felt it everywhere. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't going to let me go. There had been no rescue, no salvation, no escape. I had been doomed from the start. My mind swirled with thoughts of the hospital, of the people who had disappeared inside its walls. I had seen them, their faces twisted in terror, their screams muffled by the thick walls. They were gone now, but in a way, they were still there. Trapped. In the same place as I was. Because once you entered that building, you never truly left. Your body might escape, but your soul, your essence, it remained behind. And I was no different. I looked around once more, as if searching for some sign of life, something that could pull me from this despair. But the streets remained empty. The buildings were lifeless husks. The city had died along with the hospital. And I was its last reminder, the last echo of its horrible history. I tried to stand up, to continue moving, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was as if the weight of everything, the fear, the exhaustion, the horror, had rooted me to the ground. I couldn't escape, and deep down, I knew there was no place left to go, no other path to take. The world around me seemed to warp, to distort, as if the fabric of reality itself was unraveling. I saw flashes, flickers of images, of people, of things that shouldn't be. They were just glimpses, fragments, but they filled me with a sense of dread unlike anything it ever felt. I wanted to scream, to run, but it was as if my voice had been stolen, my body frozen in place. And then, as the darkness closed in around me, I understood. The hospital hadn't been abandoned. It was never truly gone. It existed in a place beyond time, beyond reality, a place where the living and the dead could meet, could merge. The presence, the force that had followed me, it was the hospital itself. It was the souls, the remnants of all those who had suffered and died within its walls. And they weren't gone. They were never gone. They were here, with me, always. And in that moment, I knew what had happened. The building had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many before me. I was trapped, bound to it, and no matter how far I ran, I would never truly escape. I closed my eyes, sinking into the silence, knowing that I was lost. The nightmare was endless, and it would never end. Not for me. Not for anyone who had ever stepped inside those cursed walls. And as the darkness engulfed me, I realized the truth. I wasn't running from it anymore. I had become part of it, and there would be no waking up from this. I spent most of my days out on the water, checking equipment and ensuring everything was running smoothly. It was a peaceful job, with the occasional excitement when a ship came in or a storm passed through. But nothing could have prepared me for the series of events that unfolded at an old lighthouse just outside of town. The lighthouse stood on a small, craggy island just off the coast of our town. It had been abandoned for years, ever since the newer lighthouse had been built farther out into the bay. The island, surrounded by thick fog for most of the year, seemed to have a reputation of its own. The locals had a certain respect for it, though no one ever really talked about it. The place was avoided, like it had some unspoken rule that you don't get too close. For some reason, I found myself intrigued by this lonely beacon. It wasn't until one afternoon, when I got a call from my superior, that I realized I would be visiting it. There had been reports of some strange disturbances around the area, and the authorities had asked the Coast Guard to investigate. I wasn't exactly thrilled. The last thing I wanted to do was spend a day in an old, abandoned lighthouse. But it was part of the job, and I was always the kind of person who didn't back down from a challenge. My team and I set out that morning. The sea was calm, and the sky was overcast. As we approached the island, I couldn't help but feel the eerie silence that surrounded the place. There was no sign of life, no boats in sight, no birds calling from above. Just a vast, empty quiet that felt unnatural. I wasn't alone, of course. Along with me were two colleagues, Marcus, the station's senior technician, and Pete, the newest recruit, who had been assigned to us for the first time that day. Both of them seemed fairly indifferent to the mission. Marcus was a seasoned veteran who had been with the Coast Guard for over 15 years, and Pete, well, he was still in the phase where everything seemed like an adventure. It was a little unsettling, but I had no choice but to follow along. As we made our way to the lighthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The closer we got, the more I started to notice how out of place the structure seemed. It wasn't just old, it looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the door barely hanging on its hinges, and the walls were covered in thick moss and grime. It was clear that no one had been there in ages, and yet, something told me we weren't alone. The strange thing was, none of us really spoke about it. Marcus, as usual, stayed quiet, but I could see the subtle glances he shot at the lighthouse. Pete, however, seemed far too eager to step inside, as if he were excited to explore the building, oblivious to the sense of foreboding that seemed to fill the air. We made our way up to the door, and as I placed my hand on the rusted handle, I noticed the slight chill in the air. The kind of cold that only exists in places that have been untouched for far too long. It was like the temperature dropped a few degrees in an instant. I pushed the door open with a groan, and we stepped inside. The inside of the lighthouse was just as unsettling as the outside. Dust and cobwebs filled the air, and the scent of stale air hung thick around us. But there was something else, too, a faint, almost imperceptible smell of salt water, like the sea had crept its way inside and settled in the walls. I had worked on the water for long enough to know that smell, but I couldn't explain why it lingered here, so far from the shore. The stairs spiraled upward, the wood creaking under our weight as we made our way to the top. Each step seemed to echo in the silence of the room. I kept telling myself it was just an old building, nothing more, but deep down I could feel that something was watching us. Every time I looked out the windows, the fog seemed to grow thicker, as if the very island itself was trying to keep us there. The deeper we went, the more I had the distinct sense that we were intruders in a place that should have remained forgotten. At the top of the lighthouse, we found the lens, the beacon that had once guided ships safely through the bay. It was cracked, its light long extinguished. We inspected the equipment, making a note of the damage. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but the atmosphere of the place was starting to gnaw at my mind. Every creak of the building, every shadow that moved in the corner of my eye, made me jump, even though I knew it was just the wind. That was when it happened. The first of many signs that something wasn't quite right. It started with a faint sound, almost like a whisper. It came from below, from somewhere deep in the structure. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Marcus didn't react, but Pete, who had been inspecting the lens, stopped suddenly, looking around in confusion. "Did you hear that?" Pete asked, his voice shaking. I didn't respond at first. Instead, I strained to listen. There it was again, a soft rustling, followed by what sounded like footsteps. But no one else was supposed to be here. The island had been abandoned for years. Marcus looked up from his work and caught my eye. There was a glimmer of unease in his usually calm expression. "Probably just the building settling," he muttered. But there was a slight tremor in his voice that made me wonder if he too had felt the same sense of discomfort. We continued our inspection, though every movement seemed to send a shiver down my spine. It wasn't until we reached the bottom of the lighthouse again that I realized the full extent of the strange things happening around us. That was when we found the old logbook. It had been left behind in one of the drawers, hidden away as though someone had wanted to keep it out of sight. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink was faded, but the words were still legible. As I opened it, I couldn't help but feel a chill run through me. It was filled with entries from the lighthouse keeper, dated back to the early 1900s. But the last few pages were different, scratched out in messy handwriting, almost as if someone had been in a panic when they wrote it. I read the last entry aloud, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "The light does not stay lit. I hear them again. Their voices. I cannot escape." Pete looked over my shoulder, and his eyes widened. Who was writing this? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we weren't alone. Something was in that lighthouse with us. Something ancient, something restless. We had been in the lighthouse for only a few hours, yet already I could feel the tension mounting. There was an odd, unexplainable sensation in the air, a heaviness that seemed to press down on me the longer we stayed. I chalked it up to the isolation of the place, the thick fog, and the disorienting silence that enveloped the island. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After finding the logbook, we decided to take a short break. Marcus suggested we head down to the ground floor to gather our thoughts and discuss the next steps. Pete, being the eager new recruit, insisted on exploring the surrounding area outside the lighthouse, hoping to find some clues about the place's history. I, on the other hand, just wanted a moment to breathe. The air in the lighthouse was heavy, thick with dust and the smell of rotting wood. We split up. Marcus and I stayed in the main room, and Pete wandered outside. As I sat down on a creaky wooden chair, I couldn't help but glance at the walls, covered with old photos and faded maps of the coastline. The pictures showed a time when the lighthouse had been in full operation, with ships lining the bay and bustling townspeople walking the shores. It seemed almost too idyllic, too normal for a place that now felt so ominous. But as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. There was a single photograph, slightly apart from the others. It showed the lighthouse keeper standing in front of the building, smiling at the camera. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, but what caught my eye wasn't his attire. It was the shadowy figure standing just behind him, partially obscured by the mist. The figure was tall and indistinct, but its shape was unmistakable. It wasn't a person. It was too wrong. I stared at it for a moment, my heart beginning to race. It could have been a trick of the light, a trick of the fog. But something about it felt wrong. I felt a sudden jolt as I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, expecting to see Marcus, but instead it was Pete, looking a bit shaken. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, panting heavily as though he had just run back from a long distance. "Pete," I asked, my voice a little too sharp. "What's wrong?" He swallowed hard before responding. "There's something out there," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "I swear I saw something move in the fog." I frowned. "You saw something?" "Yeah," Pete said, his voice trembling. "A figure. It was moving around the rocks just outside the lighthouse. I don't know what it was, but it didn't look human." I looked at Marcus, who was now standing by the door, listening intently. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced by an unusual tension, his brow furrowed in concern. "You've been outside for less than 10 minutes, Marcus said, his voice flat. "There's nothing out there. It's just the fog playing tricks on you." But Pete wasn't convinced. His eyes darted to the window, as though he expected to see the figure again. "I know what I saw," he insisted. "It was moving fast. Almost too fast. And it wasn't like a person walking. It was more. Like it was gliding." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to believe him. I wanted to dismiss it as just the fog, the isolation, the unfamiliarity of the place. But deep down, I knew something wasn't quite right. There was a presence here, something that had been lingering for far too long. Something that didn't belong. Marcus, ever the skeptic, stepped forward. "All right, calm down, both of you," he said, his voice low but authoritative. "It's probably just an animal, a deer or a large bird. The fog can make things look strange, especially in places like this." But Pete wasn't calming down. His hands were shaking now, his breath coming in short gasps. "It wasn't an animal," he said, his voice rising with panic. "I know what I saw. It was standing still, watching me. And then it disappeared, into the fog." We all stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of Pete's words hanging in the air. I tried to rationalize it, tried to tell myself that it was just the fog playing tricks on his mind, that the isolation was getting to him. But deep down, something told me that Pete wasn't making this up. Something was out there. Something that we couldn't see. I'll go check it out, Marcus said finally, breaking the silence. Stay here. If anything happens, I'll call for help. But as Marcus moved toward the door, Pete stopped him, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. Don't go out there, he said urgently. Please. I don't know what it is, but I'm telling you, it's not safe. Marcus pulled away, brushing off Pete's grip. I'm just going to have a look. Stay here. And with that, he left. Pete and I sat in the dimly lit room, the silence enveloping us once more. Time seemed to slow down as we listened to the sounds of Marcus' footsteps fading into the distance. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the cracks in the lighthouse, but it didn't help to drown out the gnawing feeling of unease growing inside me. I glanced at Pete. He was staring at the window, his eyes wide and fixed, as though he were looking for something, waiting for something to appear. What do you think it was? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Pete didn't look at me. I don't know, he said quietly. But I don't think it's something we should ignore. It doesn't feel right. His words echoed in my mind, and for the first time, I found myself questioning everything. What if Pete was right? What if something was out there, something that we couldn't see or understand? The air felt heavier now, thicker with the sense that we weren't alone. A sudden crash from outside snapped me out of my thoughts. I shot to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound had come from behind the lighthouse, followed by a series of frantic footsteps. It was Marcus, running back toward the building. What happened? I shouted as he burst through the door, his face ashen, his eyes wide with fear. There's something out there, he gasped, panting heavily. Something. I don't know what it is, but it's moving and it's not human. I could see it in his eyes. Marcus, the seasoned veteran, was shaken. This wasn't just the fog. This wasn't just an animal. Something was out there, something that had been waiting for us. And whatever it wasn't going to let us leave. The hours that followed were a blur of anxiety and confusion. The once dominant daylight had long since faded, leaving the lighthouse bathed in a faint, ghostly glow from the lamp's flickering light. Despite Marcus' insistence that everything was fine, the atmosphere in the room had shifted irreparably. Every noise seemed amplified, each creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind slamming against the walls, each whisper of the fog as it shifted and swirled outside. It was like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. We were on edge. Every movement felt exaggerated. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of the air thickening with each passing minute, pushing in on me. I could hear Pete shifting in the corner, his every exhale heavy with fear. His wide eyes darted around, scanning the room as though expecting something to leap from the shadows. The tension between us had grown since Marcus returned. Pete was convinced there was something out there, and his fears were contagious. Still, Marcus pushed forward with his plan. We need to figure out what's going on, he said, his voice clipped and tight. This place, it's playing tricks on us. We're not going to get anywhere sitting here. Then what do you want us to do? Pete snapped, his voice tinged with irritation. Go out there and face whatever that thing is? Marcus was unmoved. He moved to the window and peered through the fog. We don't have a choice. We're stuck here. We need to understand what we're dealing with. I'm not leaving without answers. I didn't argue. If anything, I agreed with Marcus. But deep down, the creeping dread was gnawing at me, urging me to listen to Pete's instincts. Something about this place felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the fog, or the isolation, or even the strange occurrences we had already witnessed. It was the way the lighthouse seemed to hum with a presence, something old and dark, like it had been waiting for us to arrive. We decided to split up once more. Pete and Marcus would head down to the lower levels and investigate the source of the strange noises. I would stay in the main room, scanning the outside through the murky windows. I told myself it was the rational decision, that we needed to cover all our bases. But as I looked through the glass, all I saw was the thick fog. It was impenetrable, like a wall that separated us from whatever lay beyond. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I stood there, my eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the rocks in the distance. Every so often, a shadow would shift just outside my vision, and I would jerk away from the window in a panic. But when I looked again, nothing was there. I tried to calm myself, taking deep breaths, but the unease only grew. It was as if the fog itself was alive, pressing against the lighthouse like a suffocating hand. Suddenly, a sharp crash broke the silence, followed by a muffled voice calling my name. I turned quickly, my heart leaping into my throat. It was Pete. His voice was strained, panicked. "James, get down here. You need to see this." I didn't hesitate. I bolted from the room, my pulse pounding in my ears as I raced down the narrow staircase, the old wood creaking beneath my feet. I found them in the lower levels, standing in the dark, their faces pale and drawn. The flickering light from a single lantern cast strange, shifting shadows across the room, and for a moment I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. "There's something down here," Marcus said in a voice barely above a whisper. "We found a door. It wasn't there before." I stared at him, confused. "A door? What do you mean?" Pete nodded, his hand shaking slightly as he pointed toward the far corner of the room. There, in the stone wall, was a door, old and rusted, its edges covered in thick layers of dust. But what was strange wasn't the door itself. It was the fact that none of us had noticed it before. We had been in this very room for hours, and yet somehow it had remained hidden. Marcus approached the door cautiously, his fingers brushing the weathered wood. "It's been here all along," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "How did we miss it?" I didn't have an answer. I couldn't make sense of it. "So, what now?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. Pete stepped back, clearly uncomfortable. "We don't know what's behind it. It could be another room, or..." His voice trailed off, and he didn't finish his thought. I felt it then, the hair on the back of my neck standing up, the feeling of being watched intensifying. The temperature in the room had dropped suddenly, a chill settling in the air that had nothing to do with the drafts coming through the cracks in the walls. Something about the door felt wrong. It didn't belong here, didn't belong in this lighthouse. "We need to open it," Marcus said, his tone decisive. "We're not leaving until we figure out what's going on." He reached for the handle, his breath shallow. But as his hand made contact, the air around us seemed to shift, a low hum vibrating through the room. The hairs on my arms stood on end as a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. My stomach twisted, and I took a step back, unable to shake the feeling that whatever was behind that door was not something we were meant to find. The door creaked as Marcus slowly pulled it open, the rusty hinges protest with an eerie screech. The air grew even colder as a dark, narrow staircase appeared before us, leading down into the depths of the lighthouse. I looked at Pete, who was standing behind me, his face ghostly pale. His eyes were wide with fear, and for the first time since we had arrived, he wasn't speaking. He was frozen, staring into the dark abyss below. "We have to go down there," Marcus said, his voice unsteady but firm. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a mistake. I tried to speak, to voice the unease that was gnawing at me, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself following Marcus down the stairs, drawn to the darkness like a moth to a flame. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the further we descended, the more oppressive the air became. The temperature dropped so low it felt like the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating us with their weight. At the bottom of the stairs, we found a small room, barely large enough for the three of us to stand in. The floor was covered in dust, and the air was thick with decay. But it was the walls that caught my attention. They were covered in strange symbols, carved into the stone with what looked like sharp, jagged tools. I couldn't make out most of them, but one thing was clear. They weren't the kind of markings made by a normal person. There was something ancient, something primal about them. And then there was the smell. A rancid, putrid stench that seemed to permeate the room. It was almost suffocating, and I had to force myself not to gag. Pete gagged anyway, his hand clenching over his mouth as he stumbled backward. "This isn't right," he whispered, his voice barely audible. And I knew, deep down, I knew that whatever had been waiting for us in this lighthouse wasn't finished with us yet. It had been waiting for someone to open the door, to uncover its secrets. But now that we had, it was only a matter of time before it would make its move. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. And this time, I didn't just feel it from the outside. Something was here with us. Something that had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The door slammed shut behind us, and for the first time since we had arrived, I realized there was no way out. As we stood in the cramped, dank chamber at the base of the stairs, the air seemed to grow heavier by the second. The walls around us were marked with those strange, ancient symbols, etched deeply into the stone, as if carved by something far beyond human hands. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to climb back up the stairs and shut the door behind us, but I couldn't. We were in too deep now. Pete, his hand still clutched tightly over his mouth as he fought against the overwhelming stench, took a shaky step backward. "This is wrong," he whispered. His voice quivered as though he couldn't even comprehend the gravity of what we had discovered. Marcus, however, seemed mesmerized by the symbols, his fingers brushing over them as if trying to unlock some forgotten riddle. "Look at this," he murmured, voice barely audible. "These aren't just random markings. They mean something." I wasn't sure if it was the oppressive atmosphere or the growing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach, but something about the room felt alive, like it was pulsing, waiting for something. The temperature in the room had dropped to an unbearable chill, and with every breath I took, I could feel the cold seeping deeper into my bones. I shivered uncontrollably. Then the humming began. At first, it was subtle, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The sound was soft at first, like distant thunder rumbling far beyond the lighthouse. But it grew louder, more distinct, until it was impossible to ignore. The sound seemed to thrum through my chest, rattling my ribcage with its intensity. Marcus froze, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. It's coming from the symbols," he whispered, pointing to the strange carvings on the walls. I tried to move, to take a step back, but my legs felt heavy, too heavy to move. It was like the room was holding me in place, paralyzing me with its presence. Pete looked at me, his face drained of color, eyes wide and unblinking. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. And then, the door, the one we had entered through, slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The sound of it reverberated through my skull, sending a jolt of panic straight to my core. We were trapped. The door had been solidly locked behind us, but I hadn't heard the sound of a lock turning. It was as if the room itself had sealed us in, forcing us to stay and witness whatever it was that was about to unfold. Pete's breathing became frantic, erratic, his hands trembling violently as he grabbed at the stone walls, trying to pull them apart, trying to find any escape. "Let us out. Please, let us out," he screamed, but the words sounded hollow, swallowed up by the oppressive silence that followed. The humming grew louder, and with it, the temperature in the room plunged. My breath came out in sharp, frosty clouds as I struggled to maintain my composure. It felt like the very air was tightening around us, each breath more difficult to take than the last. And then we saw it. The symbols on the walls began to shift, as if they were alive, writhing like serpents in the stone. The lines twisted and turned, contorting into shapes I couldn't make sense of. The walls began to tremble, and the ground beneath our feet shook violently. The vibrations were so intense, I could feel them deep in my chest, like my very bones were being rattled apart. And that's when we saw the figure. At first, it was nothing but a shadow, a dark, shifting shape in the corner of the room, barely discernible against the blackness. But then, as if the darkness itself were being peeled away, the shape became clearer, more defined. It was tall, taller than any man, its form obscured by a heavy cloak of inky blackness. The air around it shimmered, distorting everything it touched, like it was a presence that didn't belong in our world. Pete backed away slowly, his feet stumbling as if his legs refused to hold him up. "It's not real. It can't be real," he muttered under his breath, his voice breaking. His eyes were wide with terror, tears welling up as he shook uncontrollably. He couldn't look at it. None of us could. Marcus, however, stood rooted to the spot. He didn't flinch. His eyes, too, were wide with fear, but there was something else there, something like fascination. "Do you see it?" he breathed, his voice barely audible. This is what's been calling to us. This is why we came here." I wanted to scream at him, to grab him and pull him away from whatever this thing was, but my body refused to obey. My legs locked in place, my muscles frozen as I watched the figure move. Slowly, it advanced toward us, its form shifting and undulating like liquid darkness, folding in on itself and then reforming, as if it were a nightmare made flesh. The room felt colder with each step it took, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of dread that made my stomach churn. The figure stopped just in front of Marcus. I could see its face, or rather, where its face should have been. It was nothing but a void, an abyss where its eyes and features should have been. It was a darkness so deep that it seemed to swallow the light around it, and as it leaned toward Marcus, I could feel the weight of its gaze, even though it had no eyes. Marcus reached out a trembling hand, as if compelled by some unseen force. "I knew it," he whispered, a broken smile playing at the corners of his lips. "This is it. This is the answer." I could feel the fear in my chest, squeezing tighter with every second. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't here to answer our questions. It wasn't here to guide us. It was here to take us. The figure extended its hand, long skeletal fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally, their tips brushing against Marcus' skin. As it made contact, Marcus' body jerked violently, as if something had been siphoned from him, something vital. His eyes widened, and his mouth fell open, but no sound came out. He'd screamed. It was a raw, primal sound that shattered the silence, but it did nothing to stop the figure. Nothing could stop it. I could see Marcus' body convulsing in its grip, his skin paling as his life force seemed to drain away. And as I watched, I realized with horrifying clarity, this was no mere spirit, no ghost seeking revenge. This was something ancient, something far beyond our understanding. The figure's hand withdrew, and Marcus collapsed to the ground, his body a lifeless shell. The life had been drained from him in seconds. Pete was hysterical now, his body trembling uncontrollably as he backed away from the figure, but there was nowhere to go. The walls had closed in, and the door behind us remained sealed. I wanted to run. My instincts screamed for me to flee, but my legs refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in the same dreadful, suffocating presence. The world around me felt like it was disintegrating, a blur of broken images and distant sounds. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my vision was clouded with tears I hadn't even realized I was shedding. I could still hear Pete's frantic sobs echoing in the chamber, a sound that seemed to reverberate off the walls with a maddening intensity. The figure had turned its gaze toward me, toward us, but before I could comprehend what was happening, the darkness seemed to fold in on itself. The temperature in the room had plummeted further, if that was even possible. The cold was suffocating, each breath now an agonizing effort. My legs shook with fear and exhaustion as I tried desperately to move, but my feet wouldn't obey. I couldn't look away from the shadow in front of me, and yet some force seemed to pull at the corner of my mind, telling me to look behind me. I don't know what made me do it, but I spun around. I had no idea how I managed to force my legs to move, but the desperation to escape was stronger than the paralyzing fear that gripped my chest. Pete was on his hands and knees now, sobbing uncontrollably. His eyes were wide with terror, his face pale and drawn. He reached for Marcus' body, but his hands seemed to go straight through him. There was nothing left of Marcus except for his lifeless form, his body now nothing more than a vessel, drained of its essence. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want to see what had happened to him. But I had to. I had to keep moving. My body, though trembling uncontrollably, seemed to follow the instinct that had been driving me since the figure first revealed itself. I reached for the door, my hands slick with sweat, but when I gripped the handle, I felt a coldness that sent shockwaves through my spine. The door was sealed shut. The fear that gripped my heart now was pure terror, unlike anything it ever felt before. I could feel it crawling inside of me, making my skin prickle, my stomach churn. My mind raced, desperately searching for an explanation, for a way out, but nothing made sense. The symbols on the walls, the markings, had been some sort of portal, an invitation perhaps. It had all led to this. But why us? Why here? The air was thick now, thick with dread, thick with something I couldn't name. I could feel my own breath coming in shallow gasps, each one colder than the last. My fingers, numbed from the cold, slid over the stone, searching for any trace of a way out, anything to break the hold the place had over us. Then I heard it. A low rumble, almost like thunder, shaking the very foundation of the lighthouse. I looked around wildly, and for the first time, I realized something. The walls themselves were moving. The symbols, the carvings in the stone, they weren't just static. They were shifting, twisting, pulsing with an unnatural life of their own. And then, suddenly, a beam of light shot out from the far side of the room. The harsh, cold light seemed to cut through the thick darkness, slicing it open like a wound. The hum that had filled the air grew louder, more intense. It wasn't coming from the symbols this time, but from the very core of the building, as if it had all been a living entity. The light grew, expanding outward like a burning star, and I found myself stumbling backward, my heart pounding faster and faster. Pete looked up, his eyes frantic and wild as the light enveloped the room. He seemed almost hypnotized by it, his gaze fixed, unblinking, on the glowing source. "What is that? What is happening?" he gasped, his voice cracking with fear. His hands clenched in front of him, as though he were trying to hold on to something real, something solid. But there was nothing to hold. I didn't know how much time had passed. It could have been seconds, or it could have been hours. The world around me seemed suspended in that blinding light, disorienting and overwhelming. My heart thudded so loudly I could barely hear myself think, but then the light flickered, dimming slightly before it flared up once again, brighter than before. It was as though the entire lighthouse was pulsing with energy, shaking with an intensity that made my teeth rattle. The very floor beneath my feet felt unstable, shifting, as though the building itself was alive, and it was screaming in agony. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pull, a coldness more intense than anything I had ever known. The air seemed to tighten around me, crushing me, suffocating me, but at the same time, I felt an overwhelming sense of pressure, as though everything I knew was about to break apart. And then, just as suddenly, the light disappeared. The room was plunged back into total darkness. Pete gasped, staggering backward, his hands flailing around in panic. I could hear him breathing raggedly, but I couldn't see him anymore. The room had gone eerily quiet, too quiet. The unnatural hum that had filled the space was gone, leaving nothing but the echo of our gasps in its wake. I was frozen in place, the terror still coursing through my veins, but in the distance, I saw something moving. A figure, small at first, but then growing larger, materializing out of the darkness. It was Marcus. At least, it looked like Marcus. But something was wrong. His skin was pallid, his eyes empty. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. He reached out toward us with stiff, unnatural movements, and I could feel the chill of his presence in the air as he advanced. "Marcus," I whispered, voice barely audible, my throat tight with fear. He didn't respond. His eyes remained locked on us, but there was nothing behind them, nothing but a deep, unyielding void. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, He vanished. The figure was gone. The room was still. The air was heavy, oppressive, but it felt different now. The cold had receded, and the darkness, while still thick, seemed to be lifting. It wasn't gone entirely, but I could feel the pressure easing. We were still trapped in the lighthouse, but in that moment, a sense of clarity pierced through the fog of fear that had consumed me. The darkness was receding, not just in the room, but in my mind as well. It was like a veil had been lifted. The weight of what we had discovered, the terror we had experienced, it was starting to make sense. We weren't meant to understand what had happened here. We weren't meant to know the answers. I knew then, with a certainty that struck me to my core, that whatever had lived in that lighthouse, whatever force had called us there, wasn't done with us. It would never truly let us go. We had been part of something ancient, something that had existed long before we had arrived. And no matter where we went, we would always carry the shadow of that lighthouse with us. When we finally stumbled outside, the early morning light greeted us like a distant memory. The world seemed brighter now, but something in me knew that what we had left behind in the dark was far from over. And as we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, deep within the lighthouse, something was watching us leave. The door would open again one day, and when it did, it would claim someone else. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and disbelief. Pete and I tried to piece together what had happened, but no amount of logic or reason could explain the events that transpired inside that lighthouse. We returned to the city, hoping that time would somehow dull the edges of our experience, hoping that we could find comfort in the normalcy of life again. But nothing felt the same. There were moments when I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I could still hear the sound of Marcus' voice, the way it had echoed in that dark room, even after he had vanished. It lingered, a ghost in my mind, and the memories of that night came rushing back in waves, each one more suffocating than the last. I had tried to tell myself that it was over. We had escaped. We were free. But the truth is, I knew that we were never really free. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how many times I shook the image of the figure from my mind, it remained. It haunted me just as it had haunted the lighthouse. And every now and then, when I closed my eyes, I could feel its cold gaze just beyond the veil of darkness. It's strange how the mind works. We spend so much of our lives trying to forget, trying to move past the things that scare us the most. We bury them deep within ourselves, hoping they'll stay there, hidden in the shadows. But they don't stay buried forever. We can never truly escape the things that haunt us. There were times when I found myself walking along the streets, hearing footsteps behind me, and I'd turn around, only to find no one there. It could have been the wind. It could have been my imagination. But then again, maybe it wasn't. I wasn't sure if Pete felt the same way, but I could see it in his eyes. The same fear, the same doubt, the same unshakable knowledge that whatever force had been in that lighthouse wasn't finished with us. We were merely part of a larger story, one that would never truly come to an end. One night, about a week after we'd returned to the city, I decided to check on the lighthouse. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I just wanted to see it with my own eyes, to reassure myself that it was just a place, a structure, and not the living nightmare it had felt like when we were there. I drove out to the coast, the familiar roads feeling different now, almost alien. It was as if the very landscape had changed, as if the shadows had grown deeper. When I reached the lighthouse, it was just as I remembered it. Silent, still. Its imposing silhouette loomed against the horizon, a silent sentinel in the night. The air was thick with the scent of saltwater and the promise of storm clouds gathering in the distance. I sat there in the car for what felt like an eternity, staring at the building. The memories of that night surged within me, the cold, the darkness, the feeling of being watched. I almost didn't want to get out of the car. Almost. But I did. I stepped onto the damp earth, the ground cold beneath my feet, and slowly walked toward the entrance. The lighthouse stood there, just as it had before, unmoving, unyielding. But now it felt different. There was something more. A sense of oppression, of something waiting, just beyond the walls, watching. I don't know what I expected. Perhaps I thought the place would feel less ominous in the daylight. Perhaps I hoped that I would see it for what it truly was, a forgotten relic of the past, just an old lighthouse with a few old stories attached. But the closer I got to it, the heavier the air seemed to grow. And then, in the distance, I thought I heard something. A whisper? A cry? No, it was the sound of the wind. But was it? I stood at the threshold, the door still locked, the same as before. I wanted to turn away, to leave it all behind, but something rooted me to that spot. It was as though the lighthouse had become a part of me now, something I couldn't escape even if I tried. Just then, as if answering a question I hadn't voiced, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the air. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, as though the slightest movement might shatter the illusion of safety. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it, the silhouette of a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the fading light. The same figure from before. It was there, watching me. I didn't scream. I didn't run. Instead, I stood there, frozen in place, feeling the weight of its presence as though it were a physical thing. It wasn't Marcus. It wasn't Pete. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was the lighthouse. The figure stepped forward, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw its face, a pale, featureless mask, twisted with a sorrowful expression. It was a face I would never forget. A face that wasn't human, and yet it was something I had always known. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't an invitation. It was a reminder. I didn't stay much longer. The figure, or whatever it was, disappeared into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared, and I found myself back in my car, driving away from the lighthouse, faster than I had ever driven before. I've never gone back since, and I don't think I ever will. Sometimes, when the night is particularly quiet, when I am alone with my thoughts, I feel the presence of the lighthouse. I feel the pull of it, just out of reach. I feel the cold, the weight of something ancient, something that has been waiting for us, waiting for someone to come back. Maybe the lighthouse is cursed. Maybe it's not. But I don't need to know. The truth doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that it will never be over. Not for me, not for Pete, and not for anyone who ever steps foot on that land.